Hi, friend. Sit back. You can pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee, wrap yourself in a blanket. Now is the time for that. Let's turn off the internal dialogue about business, plans, and this endless scrolling for a moment. I have a suggestion for you. Let's run away for an hour. At all. Not to another country, but to another era, where the main messenger is scented paper, and instead of stories, there is an artfully selected edge of the kimono sleeve peeking out from behind the screen, where likes are placed using quotes from ancient poetry, and career growth depends on the ability to distinguish 257 shades of twilight. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it is also a social network, offline only, and life in it is a continuous performance. Today we will go to the Heian era, to ancient Japan, where a girl lived. Her name was Akiko, and she, well, imagine yourself in her shoes. But instead of interviews and deadlines, she has a bride review at the imperial court. Instead of the stress of a toxic office, there are the poisonous intrigues of ladies in 12 layers of silk. And instead of a psychologist, there's a blind mystic who'll make you, well, you'll see for yourself soon enough. She, like us, was just trying to find herself, stay herself, and not break down in a world of endless rules. And you know what? Her story is about us. It's about finding support inside when everything looks like fragile porcelain from the outside. And now a small request, as a friend to a friend. If you enjoy our trip and you want such escapes from reality to happen more often, subscribe to the channel. For me, this is the most honest sign that we are moving in the right direction and that our gatherings make sense. This is the best support you can think of. And yet, I'm always incredibly curious about who's listening to me. It's called a community, but in simple terms, it's a company of good people. Therefore, if it's not difficult, throw a few words in the comments. Where are you from and what time do you have now? It magically makes our shared story room bigger and more cozy. I really read every message. Well, are you ready? Take a deep breath and we dive in. Somewhere in ancient Kyoto, the first plum petal falls. The mirror was lying. It was old, made of polished bronze, and its surface had caught so many reflections over its long life in the Fujiwara house that it seemed to have acquired its own dull gaze. Now the face of a girl was vaguely discernible in it. An oval like a petal, dark eyes wide with tension, eyebrows traced with charcoal into high, thin arcs of sorrow. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was the mouth. Akiko swallowed and a bitter taste filled everything. Iron, soot, and something vegetal, cloyingly sweet. Ohaguro, teeth blackening. Don't move, mistress. Just a little more left. The hands of the maidservant, old woman Uma, were bony and surprisingly firm for her years. She dipped the thin brush again into a small ceramic bowl of paste, thick, black, like a starless night. The smell intensified. Akiko squeezed her eyes shut. Remember, Akiko, her mother's voice came from behind the screen, even and instructive, like the clicking of prayer beads. A smile with black teeth is the height of elegance. It is maturity. It is what distinguishes a woman of noble blood from a commoner, whose smile glitters like the jaw of a hungry dog. Your smile must be a secret, a hint. It must not dazzle. It must captivate. Captivate, Akiko repeated mentally. Try to smile captivatingly when your tongue feels like it's been stung by nettles and your lips are going numb. To express languid sadness, not a desire to bite whoever invented this. The brush slid over her teeth again, lower then upper. The sensation was vile, as if her mouth were filling with warm, sticky mud. She suppressed a gag reflex. Ritual. Everything was ritual. The morning ablution, putting on the 12 layers of kimono, junihito, where each edge peeking from under a sleeve was supposed to tell a story about the season, the mood, and the wearer's lineage. Choosing the scent for the clothes, for the paper, for the hair. Composing the morning poem. Every action was a step in a complex, invisible dance. the meaning of which was to prove you do not belong to the world of crude things. You are a spirit, temporarily clad in silk and poetry. Done, Ume rasped, moving back. Akiko cautiously opened her eyes and looked into the mirror again. Her face was transformed, skin white with rice powder, eyes black like two abandoned ponds, lips scarlet and droplet-shaped, and the dark, bottomless void of her mouth when she opened it slightly. She looked older, alien, a doll that had just been finished, had its final, most important attribute placed in its hands. Now she was a complete artwork, a finished product. Stand up, let me see, said her mother. Lady Fujiwara, née from a lateral branch of the Minamoto clan, was the living embodiment of dignity. Her movements were slow, flowing, as if she were swimming, not walking. Even here in their modest country estate east of the capital, she wore no less than 8 layers, and their combination, pale lavender over dull green, with a flash of scarlet somewhere deep within, spoke of a memory of spring thunderstorms. Even though it was late autumn, her own teeth were perfectly black, as if carved from night jade. She circled Akiko, studying her in silence. Her gaze was heavy and precise, like a chisel. The weeping cherry color on the 3rd layer is chosen correctly, she finally pronounced. It hints at youth and transience. But the mist over an autumn marsh on the 5th, too gloomy. We are not preparing you to take the veil, Akiko. We are preparing you for the court. Change it to first frost on grass. Hope, a light chill, not death. Yes, mother, Akiko said quietly. She didn't even remember which particular piece of fabric was that autumn marsh. The maids assembled the robes. She merely played the role of an exquisite hanger. Lessons resume tomorrow. The calligraphy masters arriving from the capital. Your hand is still too vigorous. One should not sense the hand. Only the soul floating above the line should be felt. And poetry. Your metaphors are banal, like a rooster's crow at dawn. The moon is a mirror. Who doesn't know that? The moon should be a lone heron that forgot its reflection in the night pond. Do you see the difference? I do, mother. And the incense. You still confuse the after the rain blend with the before the rain blend. This is unacceptable. One speaks of freshness and purity, the other of anxious anticipation. Sending the wrong scent with a letter, you may offend the recipient, or worse, make yourself look foolish. Lady Fujiwara sighed, and in that sigh lay the weight of centuries, a whole history of their branch's decline. They were Fujiwara, yes, but not the ones who managed the regency and married their daughters to emperors. They were Fujiwara from the highway, whose lands were meager and influence, ghostly. Akiko was their modest investment, a beautiful, educated, trained doll to be profitably placed in the capital so that she, like a vine, would twine around some powerful trunk and pull their entire feeble garden toward the sun. Go, freshen up, and remember, from now on your smile must be deliberate. You are no longer a child. Akiko stepped out onto the narrow wooden veranda overlooking the garden. She took a deep breath, greedily gulping air not tainted by the smell of ink paste and maternal reproaches. Here it smelled of damp earth, fallen pine needles and smoke from distant huts. The garden was simple and artless. A few maples that had already surrendered their crimson to the wind, bush clover with its small pink flowers drooping, a tea house with a sagging roof. No exquisite rock gardens, no artificial streams winding around specially selected boulders. Her father, perpetually busy with local affairs and nostalgia for the capital, where he had never been invited to serve, did not spend money on such things. Akiko sat on the edge of the veranda, tucking the many layers of her robes under her. She watched the wind drive dry leaves across the gravel and thought about her future. The court, Heian, the heart of the world. She imagined it as a giant glittering screen behind which moved beautiful, faceless shadows. Everyone spoke of its brilliance, its poetry, of love described in thousands of elegant lines. But her mother, with her endless lessons, was preparing her not for love, but for war. A war where the weapons were hint, the color of a robe and a timely sent poem, where a wound was a sneer, and defeat, oblivion. Mistress, you shouldn't sit in the cold, came Um's voice, and certainly not make such a face. The face must be like a moon mask, nothing superfluous. What's wrong with it, Ume? Akiko asked without turning around. Sometimes one wants to make a simple, human face, to frown, to grimace. The old woman snorted, placing a cup of warm lotus root tea beside her. Human, that's for people. You are Fujiwara. You are the future of this house. Your face is your fate and the fate of your parents. Wear it carefully. Akiko took the cup, feeling its warmth through the thin porcelain. The future of this house, a burden that had fallen on her shoulders the day it became clear that her elder sister Yuki had married a provincial official and disappeared forever from the horizon of great ambitions. Now all hopes rested on her, the autumn child, born in the most inauspicious season for a career. The following days merged into one continuous, exhausting exercise. Morning began with calligraphy. The master, a frail old man with trembling hands but eyes like drills, made her write out characters on cheap paper until her fingers went numb. No, 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 he tapped a bone stick on the floor. The strength is not in the brush, mistress. The strength is in the forearm. The spirit must flow from the heart to the shoulder, from the shoulder to the hand, from the hand to the tip of the brush. Your line is crooked. Fear is visible in it. The imperial style requires confidence, serenity. Write more. Then came poetry. She had half an hour to compose a 5-line tanka on the given theme. A lone goose in an autumn field. She wrote, a lone goose cries over a field, hollow with gold. Where do you fly? It must be seeking the flock that vanished beyond the mountain ridge. The master, the same one for poor families couldn't afford different teachers, winced. Banal, straightforward. Where is the hint? Where is the depth? Why does the goose cry? It should call to the mist. The field is not hollow with gold. It holds a memory of the sun. And the last 2 lines, quite crude. It should be. Perhaps one day I, too, will find that forgotten path. You see? Personal, but not explicit. Sadness, but not complaint. Then came the incense. On a low table stood dozens of small lacquered boxes. Akiko, blindfolded, had to identify the blends. Path of the autumn wind, dream under the warming sun, night rain on a bamboo roof. She got confused. The scents were so complex, subtle, and her own nose seemed to refuse to grasp this science. This is freshness after the storm, mistress. Not morning dew in a pine forest, the teacher lamented. The first has a note of damp earth and ozone. The second, of pine needles and stone. You must feel it with your skin. Your future may depend on whether you guess the scent of a letter from a potential patron. By evening, she was exhausted. Her head buzzed with poems, rules, failures. The black teeth no longer seemed so disgusting. They had become part of the mask she wore from morning till night. Sometimes alone, she would approach her dim mirror and practice the languid smile. Corners of the lips up, eyes slightly lowered. It looked as if she were nauseous. She would make faces, feigning horror, disgust, anger, everything that should never ever show on her face in front of people. It was her small, secret revenge. One day, after a particularly difficult poetry lesson, when the master in frustration called her verses worthy of a village headman, she ran away, not far. Just to the far corner of the garden, where beyond a half-ruined fence the forest began, there was an old creaky well and a bench under a huge ancient plum tree. This was her place, a place where she could be just Akiko, not Fujiwara, no Akiko, the family honor restoration project. She sat hunched, clutching the folds of her kimono in her fists. Today she had only 5 layers on, a home version. The sky grew overcast, a dampness rose. It would rain soon. Good. Let it pour. Let it wash away all this powder, All these invented scents, all this heavy, suffocating grace. The first drops fell, heavy and sparse, leaving dark spots on the gravel. Akiko was about to head back when she noticed a forgotten bundle on the bench under the plum tree. One of the servants, probably. But looking closer, she saw it wasn't just a rag. It was a scroll, rather worn but with expensive jade finials on the rods. The rain intensified. Akiko rushed forward. The thought that a scroll, any writing could perish from water, was instinctively unacceptable to her. She grabbed it, pressed it to her chest under the folds of her kimono, and looked around for where to run. The roof of the tea house was closer than the main house. She dashed under the low sloping roof just as the sky truly opened up. The rain drummed on the shingles, hissed in the mossy garden. Inside smelled of mold, old wood, and dust. Akiko caught her breath and carefully pulled out the scroll. It was slightly damp at the edges, but otherwise intact. What was it? Love letters? An account book? Out of curiosity, or perhaps a desire to distract herself from her own thoughts, she carefully untied the silk cord and unrolled the scroll. It wasn't prose, nor ordinary poetry. They were technical drawings, schematics of some complex mechanism, accompanied by columns of characters. She didn't understand everything, but she recognized some words. Water wheel, transmission, lift, irrigation. It was a project for a machine. For watering fields? Small peasant figures were drawn on the fields for scale. The drawings were made with a confident but unornamented hand. Lines clean, practical, no frills. I see you saved from ruin not only a scroll, but the fruit of 6 months' work. A voice came from the entrance. Akiko started and turned around. In the doorway, veiled by the rain curtain, stood a young man. He was soaked to the skin. His simple, dark hempen robe, tied with a rope, clung to his body. His hair, gathered in a careless bun, was disheveled, and wet strands fell into his face. He wore no hat or umbrella, but what struck Akiko most were his eyes. Intelligent, lively, with a faint spark of irony. And his teeth, they were white, perfectly indecently, commoner white. He was not of noble birth, that was clear at a glance, but his posture held neither servility nor obsequiousness. I found it under the tree, Akiko said shyly, automatically lowering her gaze as befitted a noble maiden, but then looking up at the stranger again. She had been raised not to speak with strange men, but here, in the rain, in the old tea house, the rules seemed to have lost their force. The edges got wet, I hope not badly. The young man stepped inside, wiping water from his face. Don't worry, the paper is special, treated with thuja oil. It can handle a little moisture. Thank you for not letting it turn to mush. He held out his hand. Akiko handed over the scroll. Their fingers touched briefly. His hands were rough, calloused, but his fingers, long and elegant. You are an engineer? She asked cautiously, surprised at her own boldness. He smiled. The smile was open, without a shadow of the reclusive secrecy she had been taught. In a way, more of an applied scholar. My name is Tsutomu. I'm passing through. Your father, Lord Fujiwara, kindly allowed me to examine your rice paddies regarding possible irrigation improvements. This scroll contains my thoughts on the matter. Tsutomu. Diligent. A simple name, not noble. And you understand this? He nodded at the drawings. Akiko felt blood rush to her cheeks. She had been taught music, poetry, the art of dressing, not drafting, lifting mechanisms. No, I don't know such things. It seemed curious to me, unlike ordinary scrolls. Because it's not about the soul, but about deeds, Tsutomu said, unrolling the scroll and pointing to one of the diagrams. See? Here the water wheel catches the stream's current. It rotates this shaft, and through this system of gears and levers, it lifts water 3 shaku higher than usual, can irrigate the upper fields. It will save the labor of 20 men. He spoke with enthusiasm, his eyes alight. Akiko listened, mesmerized. No one had ever spoken to her about something real, tangible. The world he described was a world of forces, materials, useful results. It was as far from her world of hints and aromas as the earth from the moon. That's brilliant, she said sincerely. But isn't your business supposed to be poetry or court service? Tsutomu snorted, rolling up the scroll. I write poetry too, sometimes even decently. But poetry won't feed the hungry. And court service, he grimaced. There's too much talk about the correct shade of twilight and too little about the correct slope of a canal. I was taken into the Ministry of Popular Affairs thanks to patronage. Now I'm obliged to travel, look, calculate, and try to make sure taxes are paid in grain, not tears. A ridiculous position. No power, no money, just headaches and mud up to your knees. He spoke so lightly, so dismissively of what her father could only dream of. Service in the capital, even in such a humble ministry. And his words held not a trace of deference to those very talks about twilight that constituted the essence of Akiko's upbringing. Don't you think that all this, she waved her hand vaguely towards the main house, is too complicated? All these layers, these scents, these rules for folding a letter? Tsutomu looked at her attentively. His gaze was studying, but not judgmental. Complicated? Yes, insanely complicated. Like living in a house made entirely of fragile porcelain, where every clumsy movement threatens disaster. But you see, mistress. Akiko, she said unexpectedly, even to herself. He nodded. Akiko, this porcelain house is our civilization. It is beautiful. It is fragile. It may seem meaningless to someone who measures life by the harvest, but within it, poems are born that will live 1,000 years. Paintings that make the heart stop. The problem is not the house. The problem is that some of its inhabitants have forgotten that there is a world outside its walls, and that a house must stand on a foundation, not float in the clouds. They've forgotten that one can love both poetry and water wheels, not just be a shadow on a screen, but also the hand that draws a diagram. The rain began to subside, turning into a fine drizzle. The light breaking through the clouds became silvery and cold. You say strange things, Tsutomu-sama, Akiko said quietly. Because the world is strange, Akiko-sama. And funny. Imagine a vast empire where a person's career can be ruined because he wore socks of the wrong shade of gray, where a girl must blacken her teeth to prove she's not a peasant, where love begins not with a glance, but with the scent of paper. It's a grand, magnificent absurdity. He said it with such warm, sympathetic irony that something inside Akiko quivered and shattered, like melting ice. No one, not her mother, not her teachers, not even old Ume, had ever acknowledged the absurdity of this world. They only forced her to live in it as a given. And this soaked, low-born scholar with white teeth looked at it from the outside and called it funny. And there was no malice in it. There was understanding. I think you should go, Tsutomu said, looking at the brightening sky. Your maids are probably sounding the alarm by now, and I need to discuss these drawings with the steward. Thank you again for the scroll and for the conversation. He bowed, not with the deep ceremonial bow of a courtier, but with a short, almost friendly nod of the head, and he left, stepping lightly on the wet gravel, not even trying to avoid puddles. Akiko stood under the roof for a long time, watching him go. Something in her chest sang and ached simultaneously. He had seen in her not a doll, not a project, not a Fujiwara. He had seen a person with whom to talk about absurdity. He had kindled in her a tiny but fierce spark. What if she could be both? Both a shadow on the screen and the hand that draws a diagram. When she returned to the house, her mother was waiting in the main hall with a face as cold as a winter pond. Where were you? Your incense lesson began half an hour ago. You're wet and look disheveled. I was sheltering from the rain, Mother, in the tea house. Alone? Akiko hesitated for less than a second. Alone. Lady Fujiwara gave her a scrutinizing look but did not press. Go change and get ready. The day after tomorrow, we leave for the capital. A letter just arrived. Your cousin, Lady Uma, has agreed to take you into her retinue at the palace. This is our fortune. Now everything depends on you. Her mother's words fell on Akiko like heavy stones. The day after tomorrow. So soon. The porcelain house was calling her inside. Beautiful, fragile, absurd. Yes, mother, she said, and her voice sounded even and obedient. But inside, beneath the 12 layers of rules and expectations, there, where the memory of the gaze of intelligent eyes and the sound of frank laughter at the world's absurdity still glimmered, that spark did not die. It merely hid, like a seed under winter snow. The night before departure, she approached the mirror again. In the reflection, a beautiful, white mask with a black, secret smile looked back at her. A doll preparing for a grand performance. Akiko slowly, overcoming internal resistance, gave her face an expression of languid, mysterious sadness. The corners of her lips trembled and rose. Her eyes lowered slightly. It turned out better, almost perfect. And then, making sure no one was around, she quickly, childishly, twisted her lips, stuck out her tongue into the blackness of her mouth, and screwed up her eyes for a moment. One last time. In the morning, an ox-drawn carriage awaited her. Her mother, her father with an important and agitated air. Servants lined up. The farewells were brief and ceremonial. Akiko, dressed in her best, capital-ready layers, first frost on grass instead of autumn marsh, took her place behind the bamboo blinds that would hide her from curious eyes on the road. The carriage jolted into motion, its wheels creaking on the rutted road. Akiko did not look out to take a last glance at the house, the garden, the old plum tree. She sat motionless, straight as an arrow. On her lap lay a small lacquered box with personal belongings, and among them, a neatly folded scrap of cheap paper on which her awkward, too energetic hand had sketched schematic drawings of a water wheel, some numbers, and 2 characters written side by side, Akiko and Tsutomu. The porcelain house awaited, and she was riding towards it. But now she carried within her a small, hard fragment of another world. A world where people smile with white teeth and believe one can love both poetry and water wheels. The road to Heian was long, and as the carriage moved farther away, Akiko felt the heavy garment of rules and expectations wrapping tighter and tighter around her, becoming a second skin. But somewhere deep within, beneath all these layers, hid the warm, unruly beat of that very laughter at absurdity. And that beat was stronger than fear. It felt like a promise. Part 2. The Palace of Flowing Time. The palace greeted her with silence. Not a quiet. Quiet exists in temples or deep mountains. This was a capital S silence, woven from the whisper of silk on polished wooden floors, from muffled footsteps in soft tabi, from the faint chime of jade ornaments on screens, from 1,000 restrained sighs, unspoken thoughts, and unheard warnings. The air here was thick, heavy with scents far more complex than in their provincial home. The finest incenses of camphor, aloes wood, sandalwood, and musk mingled with the smell of old scrolls, floor wax, and the pervasive dampness rising from the garden ponds. It was the smell of money, power, and centuries-old dust settled in the cracks between the floorboards. They were led by a servant with a face devoid of any emotion, like a clean slate. Akiko followed her mother, careful not to trip over the long, unaccustomedly heavy hems of her capital attire. 12 layers chosen by her mother for this first appearance. An outer, luxurious satin kimono, the color of late night in the 8th moon, dark blue with a purple sheen. Beneath it, glimpses of first frost, young bamboo, and somewhere deep within, blushing peony. That peony was her mother's small audacity, a hint at her daughter's blossoming beauty. Akiko felt like a warhorse clad in ceremonial, impractical armor. Every step required effort. The palace corridors seemed endless, sliding doors painted with scenes from The Tale of Genji, or landscapes in the Chinese style, succeeded one another like frames in a luxurious, recurring nightmare. From behind some came muffled voices, laughter like the tinkle of crystal beads, the click of bone abacus beads. Behind others lay that same dead silence. Sometimes they made way for a procession, a group of court ladies in clouds of silk, their faces white masks glimpsed behind the translucent curtains of carried palanquins. An official in a stiff, dark robe, gliding like a shadow, his face important and expressionless. Watch your step, but don't lower your head. Breathe evenly. Don't turn towards sounds, her mother hissed without looking back. She herself seemed the embodiment of calm, but Akiko saw the tension in her neck beneath the high collar. Finally, they stopped before a door different from the others. Its frame was of ebony, and the paper on it was of the highest quality, almost weightless, with a barely noticeable gold fleck imitating stardust. The servant slid silently behind the screen, leaving them alone in the corridor. Akiko could hear her heart beating. It thumped somewhere in her throat, threatening to escape. A voice came from behind the door, low, smooth, like honey dripping from a knife blade. "Enter!" They went in. The room was not large, but every detail screamed of unattainable status. The floor was covered with thick, perfectly fitted tatami mats, exuding the fresh scent of iris straw. Hanging on the walls were not mere paintings, but originals, as she would later learn, by a famous artist. In the alcove, the tokonoma, stood a vase of incredible shape with a single branch of flowering plum. An arrangement speaking of such flawless taste that it exuded coldness. And in the center of the room, on a small cushion before a low table, sitting as elegantly as a folded flower, was a woman. Lady Fuji. She was perhaps 45, but looked ageless. Her face was a classic oval, the whiteness of her skin seeming porcelain, lifeless. Lips painted a bright, almost bloody red, sharply contrasted with the blackness of her teeth. But the main thing was her eyes. Narrow, dark, almond-shaped. They looked at Akiko with a lazy, almost bored interest, the way one examines a new trinket brought to market. Her attire was a model of restrained luxury, layers of gray, ash, and silver merging into one another like mist over water. No bright splashes, only power, veiled as asceticism. "Sister," Akiko's mother bowed, performing a deep, reverential bow. Her voice sounded unnaturally deferential. "Niece," Lady Fuji parried with the barest nod. Her gaze slid over Akiko's figure, appraising, weighing. "Come closer, child. Let me see the fruit of my sister's care." Akiko took a few steps, feeling under that gaze as if she were turning into an open book with large, stupid letters. Lady Fuji slowly, with murderous leisure, let her eyes travel from head to toe. "The colors are diligently chosen," she finally pronounced. "The peony deep within. A bold move. Naive but bold. The figure is acceptable. The skin needs care. The provincial wind has left marks. Posture, too straight. Looks militant. We need the grace of a willow, not the steadfastness of a pine. The hands. Show me your hands." Blushing, Akiko held out her hands. Lady Fuji took one with her own long, cold fingers. Impeccable, without a single line or callus. She studied the palm, nails, the skin on the wrist, as if reading some secret map. "Worked with her hands, it shows. We will conceal it. Overall, raw material, but with potential. With teaching and diligence, something presentable can be made." Her words were not insulting. They were worse. They were a statement of fact, like livestock appraisal. There was no malice in them, only cold calculation. Akiko felt the heat of shame and anger rise to her face, but she willed herself to lower her eyes and keep an expression of respectful attentiveness. "Your face is your fate. Wear it carefully," she remembered Ume's words. "She will be assigned to Lady Ume. her mother said. As we agreed. A shadow of something that might have been a smirk passed over Lady Fuji's face. Yes, to the sweet, poetic Ume, an ideal environment for growth. All the dreamers and bunglers gather there. She will learn the basics. We shall see. Remember, girl, she turned to Akiko again, her voice becoming sweet as poison syrup. Here, in the palace, your every movement, every sigh, every fold of your clothing is a message. Learn to read the messages of others before sending your own. Ignorance is forgiven only once here. The second time is no longer ignorance, it is a challenge. She waved her hand, an elegant practiced gesture meaning the audience was over. She will be taken to the chambers of Lady Um's retinue. Sister, you may stay for tea. We need to discuss the details. Her mother threw Akiko a quick glance full of hope and anxiety and nodded. Akiko bowed and, backing away, left the room into the corridor, where another maidservant, young, with eyes fixed on the floor, already awaited her. Her new home became a tiny room in a distant wing of the palace, next to the chambers of other junior ladies in waiting. The room was minuscule, almost a cell, a tatami for sleeping, a small writing desk, a wooden chest for belongings, and a screen. The window did not overlook an exquisite garden, but an inner courtyard with outbuildings. A place for raw material, Akiko thought bitterly. But she had no time for self-pity. Within an hour, an elderly lady, introducing herself as the instructor of junior ladies in waiting, came to her and began hammering the basics of palace life into her. It was an accelerated, intensive survival course. Rule 1, the gaze. Your gaze should glide at the level of your interlocutor's waist. A direct gaze is insolence. A gaze at the floor is timidity or secrecy. Waist level, perfect. Rule 2, gait. Don't shuffle, don't stride, glide. Imagine your hips are filled with lead and your shoulders carry a crystal vase. You must move silently and smoothly, like a cloud. Rule 3, speech. No loud sounds. No sharp words. Even if you are scalded with boiling water, you must say, "Thank you for such a warm welcome." Irony is permissible, but only the kind that can be denied. Direct insult is death. Rule 4, falling. If you trip, it must look like an intentional, graceful gesture. A slight lean, perhaps with a hand touching the floor as if picking up an imaginary fallen chrysanthemum. No panic, no cries. Your disgrace must be aesthetic. Rule 5, letters. Every line is a trap or a compliment. The phrase, "How beautiful the dawn is today," can mean, "Your attire is dreadful." I admire your fortitude. You are hopelessly dull. Learn to read between the lines. And when you write yourself, every word must have a double meaning. And so on. Akiko listened, and her head began to spin. This wasn't just etiquette. It was a whole language, a parallel reality where everything meant something other than what it seemed. It was like learning magical incantations where a mistaken gesture or intonation could spell disaster. The next day, she was introduced to Lady Lady Um's chambers were different. They were located in a quieter part of the palace, overlooking a garden with weeping willows and a small pond. The air here smelled not of power, but of melancholy and poetry. Lady herself turned out to be a young woman, about 25, with a beautiful but sickly face, like that of a heroine from an old tale. Her skin was almost translucent, her eyes large and moist, her lips pale. She sat by the open door to the garden, holding a biwa lute, but not playing it. Her robes were in pastel, muted tones. Faded heather, rose ash, mist over the lake. "Ah, a new little bird," she said in a voice as quiet as the rustle of a moth's wings. "Come, child, don't be afraid." Her smile was sincere but weary. There was no icy calculation of Lady Fuji in it, only a deep, habitual melancholy. Akiko later learned that Ume was the daughter of a not very influential clan, who had come to court thanks to her poetic gift and rare beauty. But the beauty had faded under the weight of palace intrigues, and poetry had become a refuge from reality. She was loved by the emperor for her spiritual qualities, but lacked strong factional support, making her vulnerable. You will help me with correspondence, said and sometimes read aloud. My eyesight weakens from tears and dim light. She said it without drama, simply stating a fact. Thus began Akiko's life at court. The days flowed in a monotonous, tense rhythm. Mornings were for helping sorting incoming poems. Any message to the court, especially to a woman, had to be clothed in poetic form. Preparing paper and ink for replies, memorizing the names and titles of all who might send a letter. Often asked her just to sit with her in silence, looking at the garden. Sometimes silence is the best poem, she would say. Afternoons were for practice. Akiko, together with other junior ladies in waiting, practiced the art of falling, the art of serving a bowl of tea so that the sleeves formed a perfect wave, the art of laughter, concealed behind a fan sounding like the chime of little bells. They were taught to recognize incenses in a single breath and determine from which province a guest hailed by a tiny detail of embroidery on his clothing. And always gossip swirled around. It hung in the air like pollen. It was whispered behind screens, passed on with notes, encrypted in ambiguous lines of poetry. Have you heard? Lady Kiku now wears the combination autumn maple and withered grass. A direct hint at the waning of her influence after her brother botched the negotiations with the Koreans. And young advisor Minamoto sent Lady U's powder scented with flowering plum. In the third moon, everyone knows plum is a hint at her patron, old Fujiwara, whose crest is the plum blossom. He's either very bold or very foolish. They say Lady Fuji has a new game. She slipped one of the emperor's junior consorts a poetry anthology with unfortunate metaphors. The silly girl quoted them aloud before His Majesty. Now she's in disgrace and hasn't been seen for a month. Akiko listened, absorbed, learned. She quickly understood that gossip here was not idle chatter. It was currency. It was a weapon. It was a map of the minefield she had to traverse. Once she herself became its object, she was given a small roll of exquisite bluish paper of heavenly hue by one of the ladies in waiting serving another influential lady. Delighted by the attention, Akiko used it for a reply poem to Upon reading it, sighed softly. The paper is beautiful, Akiko, but do you know that heavenly hue this season is used only by the Tachibana clan, with whom our patron has strained relations? Your reply, written on this paper, might be seen as a secret sign of sympathy for them, or as foolishness. In our position, foolishness is more dangerous. Akiko went cold. She had almost compromised her mistress over a piece of paper. After this incident, she began checking every detail, every shade, every scent with the manic thoroughness of a paranoid. It was exhausting mental labor. She felt like a spy in enemy territory, where every blade of grass could be poisonous. And over all this, like a dark, cold cloud, loomed the figure of Lady Fuji. She rarely appeared in person, but her presence was felt everywhere. Her decisions influenced the arrangement of chambers, the distribution of gifts from the emperor, who would get the honorable role at the next moon viewing ceremony. Her network of spies and informants was, according to rumors, all-encompassing. Once Akiko saw one of Lady Fuji's ladies-in-waiting passing by accidentally drop her fan. Akiko, following the rules of politeness, picked it up. The girl took the fan and their fingers touched. The glance she threw at Akiko was quick, appraising, like the snap of a trap. Not a word was spoken, but Akiko understood. It was a test, surveillance. Seemed to live in her own poetic world, trying not to notice the intrigues. But sometimes the sadness in her eyes was replaced by a spark of fear. Especially when news came that Lady Fuji had held a long conversation with the emperor, or that her younger brother had received a lucrative appointment. She is like a spider, said quietly once, looking at a web silvering in the corner of the veranda. She weaves her web slowly, patiently, And when you realize you're caught, it's too late. You are already immobilized, and the poison is slowly flowing through your veins. Akiko thought of Tsutomu, of his words about the absurdity of this porcelain house. Now she understood this absurdity on her own skin. It was an absurdity that could kill. She wrote letters to him in her mind, full of irony and despair, but could not send a single one. She was isolated. Her only outlet was rare walks to the far part of the garden where wild plums grew, and where, she thought, she was not watched. One night, a strange sound woke her. Not a cry, not a moan, but a monotonous, chanting mutter, and a smell. Sharp, spicy, unpleasant smell of burnt herbs and something coppery that tickled the nostrils. Akiko lay listening. The sound came from the garden. It was the deep of night, the moon hidden behind clouds. Curiosity mixed with a bad premonition made her get up. She threw a dark cloak over her simple night kimono and, creeping like a shadow, slipped out of her room toward the garden. She walked, pressing herself to the walls. By feel, the muttering became clearer. It came from a small abandoned tea pavilion on the edge of the garden, the one that stood on the border with the unlucky northeast direction, the Gate of Demons. It was usually avoided. Akiko's heart pounded wildly. She crept up to the sliding door, which was open a crack, and peeked inside. In the pavilion, several black candles burned, their flames casting dancing, ugly shadows on the walls. In the middle, a white cloth was spread on the floor, with complex, sinister signs, magical circles and symbols she did not know, drawn on it in charcoal. Before the cloth, with her back to Akiko, stood a figure in dark, simple garments, with hair black as pitch loose and flowing. The figure swayed in time with her muttering. In her hands she held something resembling a doll, made of coarse cloth and a long, thin needle. Akiko froze, turning to ice with horror. She recognized the posture, the rigid line of the shoulders. It was Lady Fuji, but not the cold, impeccable aristocrat. This was a witch, a sorceress conducting a dark rite. The muttering grew louder. Akiko caught fragments of words, strange in an ancient, forgotten tongue. Lady Fuji raised the needle above the doll's head, where a lock of light hair, clearly not her own, was sewn. Find voice in nightmares. Fill her dreams with bile. Let her beauty melt like wax under my breath. Let every glance upon her breed disgust. Onryo, spirit of grudge, come, inhabit this form, become my vengeance. The needle plunged sharply into the doll's chest. Lady Fuji let out a cry, quiet but piercing, full of hatred and triumph. Akiko recoiled, almost giving herself away. Her legs turned to jelly. She backed away silently, then turned and almost ran back to her wing, stumbling in the dark. Her ears rang, and before her eyes stood the image. The impeccable, cold mask of the aristocrat and the wild, rage-distorted face of the sorceress merging into one horrifying portrait. She burst into her room, slammed the door behind her, and leaned against it, trembling all over. A ritual, a real dark ritual. She had heard of such things, of magic, of vengeful spirits, onryo, of curses, but she considered them superstitions, tales for dark, uneducated people. And now she had seen it with her own eyes. And the performer was one of the most influential women at court. The rules of the game are far more terrifying than they seemed, she whispered into the darkness, and her voice sounded hoarse and alien. This was not just a war of hints and poems. This was a war involving otherworldly forces. The porcelain house turned out to be not just fragile, it was haunted. And the most terrible ghosts did not wander the corridors, but sat in beautiful, exquisitely furnished chambers and wrought darkness under the cover of night. Akiko crawled to her chest and, with trembling hands, took out a small bundle, unwrapped it. Inside lay a dried hagi flower and that same scrap with the drawing of a water wheel and 2 names. She pressed the paper to her chest, trying to find in these simple, clear lines at least a grain of common sense. A hint of that other world where problems were solved with gears and canals, not with witchcraft needles. Now she understood. She was not simply in a foreign, complex world. She was in the beast's lair, and her naive dreams of being both a shadow and a hand seemed like childish babble now. To survive, she needed to learn something more than the rules of etiquette. She needed to understand the rules of this new, terrible game, and perhaps find a way to protect herself. She looked out at the black square of the window, where dawn was already breaking. Soon a new day would begin, a day of social smiles, elegant gestures, and poems about love and beauty. And beneath that thin, beautiful glaze, a real, ancient, merciless darkness would pulse, and Akiko realized that her education had only just begun. Part 3. The Language of Flowers and Fans. The first frost painted the palace gardens in brittle, glittering lace. For Akiko, it painted the inside of her lungs with a sharp, clarifying cold. The shock of that night at the pavilion had settled into a constant low hum of awareness. The world had split, like a painted screen sliced down the middle. On one side, the exquisite, sun-dappled surface of court life. On the other, a crawling, formless shadow. And she was now one of the few who could see the seam. This dual sight began to alter her. Where before she saw only bewildering rules, she now saw patterns. Patterns of attack, defense, and territorial marking as clear as a game of Go, played on a grid of silk and gossip. Her fear, once a paralyzing wave, hardened into a kind of crystalline focus. She would learn this game, not just to survive, to navigate, and perhaps one day to strike back. Her education became her armor. The endless lessons were no longer a torture, they were intelligence gathering. Under the tutelage of the stern mistress of decorum, she learned the language of the fan. A fan was not for cooling oneself, it was a semaphore. Held against the left cheek, yes. Against the right cheek, no. And drawn slowly across the forehead, you are being watched. Fluttered rapidly, hiding the lower face. I am laughing at you, but you will never prove it. Closed sharply with a snap. The conversation is over, and you have lost. Dropped accidentally. I wish to speak with you alone. She practiced in her tiny room, facing her dim reflection. The snap of the closing fan was particularly satisfying. It sounded like the breaking of a small, malicious bone. Next was the lexicon of sense. It was more complex than simple perfume preferences. It was a chemical language of allegiance and insult. Alice Woodinwarnaro, Jinko, was for formal occasions, a scent of solemnity and high status, favored by senior ministers and the emperor himself. For a woman to wear it too boldly was presumptuous. Clove, choji, was passionate, romantic, a little dangerous. To send a poem on paper scented with clove was a direct proposition. Lotus, hasu, spoke of purity and Buddhist devotion. Wearing it could be a sign of piety, or a subtle hint that one was above worldly intrigues, a useful bluff. The sophisticated, melancholic blend of plum blossom, camphor, and a hint of salt, ume gusoku, was Lady Ume's signature. To mimic it was either flattery or theft. And then there was Lady Fuji's scent. Akiko had caught it once, when the woman glided past in a corridor, a chilling, clean odor of chrysanthemum and cold stone, and kikaseki. No warmth, no humanity, just imperial austerity and impenetrable hardness. Finally, the most perilous poetry of all, the chromatics of attire. 12 layers were a canvas, and every visible sliver of color at the sleeve, neckline, and hem was a headline in a living newspaper. Today, Akiko muttered to herself one morning as her assigned maid layered the robes, I am wearing weeping willow at misty dawn over moss after autumn rain, with an accent of lonely wagtail. Ah, this ostensibly expresses a refined, poetic sorrow for the passing of autumn. She peered at the effect in her bronze mirror. The greens were grayish, the browns muted. It looked she thought with a surge of internal, rebellious laughter. Like I have a terrible stomach ache. Or perhaps that I am slowly turning into a pond. But she wore it, because understanding the code meant she could both send and intercept messages. She noticed everything. When Lady Kiku, who had been in disgrace, reappeared in a bold combination of scarlet maple and imperial gold, it wasn't a fashion choice. It was a declaration of restored confidence, a thumbing of the nose at her detractors. When a junior consort known for her vanity was seen in fading wisteria, the gossip mill exploded. Had she fallen from favor? It turned out her dye maker had simply made an error, leading to the poor woman's social ruin, a fate worse than actual disfavor, as it branded her as tasteless. Akiko's own metamorphosis was noticed first not by the great ladies, but by the other junior attendants. The timid, wide-eyed girl from the provinces was gone. In her place was a quiet, observant young woman who moved with newfound, if still practiced, grace. Her stumbles became rarer. Her silences seemed thoughtful rather than terrified. And her poetry began to shift. The occasion was the first minor poetic tournament of the season, a butterfly contest held in the Empress's smaller garden pavilion. The theme was transience. Participants, ladies of middling rank and their attendants, were to compose a tanka on the spot. The air was thick with the scent of competing perfumes and subtle anxiety. A win here could bring a flicker of notice. A clumsy verse could cement one's reputation as a dullard. Akiko stood beside Lady Ume, who was to judge one of the rounds. She watched as a smug attendant from Lady Fuji's faction, a woman with a face like a shrewd sparrow, presented her poem, written in flawless, icy calligraphy, "The morning glory's hue, so brilliant at dawn's first light, is gone by midday. A lesson writ in fleeting dew, all glory takes to flight." Polite murmurs of appreciation. It was competent, cold, obvious, but technically perfect. The sparrow woman preened. Then it was the turn of another girl, a gentle soul from a minor family who served in the archives. Nervous, she recited, "The butterfly's wing, upon which a world is painted, trembles in the breeze. Oh, to be so beautiful, and so afraid to cease." A misstep. The metaphor was lovely but vulnerable. It admitted fear. It was human. The sparrow woman from Lady Fuji's circle hid a smile behind her fan. A few others exchanged glances. The gentle girl flushed, sensing her error. A ripple of expectation moved to Lady Um's group. All eyes turned to Akiko. It was her turn, as Um's attendant, to offer a verse. A test. Her mouth went dry. She could play it safe, offer something bland and forgettable. Or she thought of the crawling darkness in the tea pavilion. She thought of the brittle beauty of this garden, masking so much rot. She thought of Tsutomu's laugh at the absurdity. Transience wasn't just about flowers and butterflies. It was about this very moment, this fragile performance. She took a slow breath and spoke her verse clearly. Her eyes lowered not in submission, but as if gazing at an internal image. The fan, painted with moonlit pines, opens, displays its borrowed scene. A breath, and then it closes. What shadow play was ever seen? To tell us what the fan means. A stunned silence followed. It was not a poem about nature. It was a poem about artifice, about the very act of performance they were all engaged in. The borrowed scene was the classical imagery they all used. The closing was the end of the performance, of life itself. And the final, almost impudent question, what shadow play was ever seen to tell us what the fan means? Was a razor-sharp query thrown at the heart of their whole coded existence. What is the point of all this? Lady beside her, drew in a soft, sharp breath. The sparrow woman's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of intense calculation. Others were bewildered, unsure if they had just been insulted or presented with profound philosophy. Then from the place of honor, The senior judge, an elderly, respected poetess, gave a slow, deliberate nod. A novel perspective, she said, her voice like dry leaves. It turns the gaze inward upon the instrument of expression itself. Unconventional, risky, but not without merit. It was not declared the winning poem. The safe, cold verse about the morning glory won. But Akiko had not lost. She had done something far more powerful. She had made them think. She had carved out a tiny space for a different kind of voice. As the gathering dissolved into polite chatter, she felt several appraising looks cast her way. Not friendly, but now, respectfully, wary. The Sparrow Woman from Lady Fuji's faction glided past, and her fan, held against her right cheek for the briefest moment, signaled no before she melted into the crowd. The message was clear: you are not one of us. Akiko, her heart hammering against her ribs, found her own fan and let it rest against her left cheek. Yes, I am not. And you have just noticed. Lady said nothing until they were back in the seclusion of her chambers. She settled by the veranda, her pale hands clasped. That was a dangerous poem, little bird. I know, Akiko admitted, kneeling beside her. It was also a very good one, Ume said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. You have been learning more than how to fold paper. You have learned to wield a metaphor like a tanto dagger, short, sharp, and aimed at the gaps in the armor. She looked out at the garden. Be careful. Daggers attract the attention of those with longer swords. The incident became a quiet cornerstone of Akiko's new reputation. She was not a dazzling beauty, not a great heiress. She was the one with the sharp, quiet mind, the girl who served the poetic and who composed verses that cut sideways. It was a niche, a defense. To attack her poetry would require engaging with it on its own terms, and that was a risk not everyone was willing to take. Her metaphors became her shield. Her internal monologue, however, remained a sanctuary of irreverence. Attended the moon viewing ceremony. Composed a verse about the lonely hare in the moon, pounding regret into rice cakes. Lady Fuji's faction interpreted it as a critique of the new tax policy on millet. I was actually just hungry. Spent 3 hours with the mistress of sense, learning to distinguish between dew on summer grass, hint of melon rind, and dew on autumn grass, hint of dry hay. Failed, smells like grass. I am a provincial cow. Wore shy violet at the stone's foot to indicate humble devotion. Was asked if I was in mourning. Note to self, violet reads as funeral to the colorblind elite. This fragile equilibrium held for a week. Then a crack of light appeared in her walled world. It came with the morning correspondence. Among the usual scrolls of poetry from admirers of salon, official notices and bland invitations, was a simple, unadorned paper packet. It was not on the expensive, perfumed paper of the court. It was sturdy, practical paper, the kind used for inventories or architectural drafts. It was sealed with plain wax, impressed not with a family crest, but with what looked like the geometric outline of a gear or a water wheel. Akiko's fingers trembled as she picked it up. No name, but she knew. The world seemed to narrow to the feel of that coarse paper. She waited until she was alone on an errand to the palace library, a dusty, quiet hall at the edge of the administrative wing. Sheltered between towering shelves of forgotten edicts, she broke the seal. The handwriting was brisk, unpracticed in the elegant flourishes of court script, yet strong and clear. To the observer of the porcelain house, I hear the china rattles on its shelves in Heian. The whispers of seismic activity in the realm of whispers have even reached the dusty offices of the Ministry of Popular Affairs, where we worry about more substantial cracks in irrigation ditches. They speak of a new voice at the poetry tournaments, one that questions the paintings on the fans. A dangerous hobby, observer, but an interesting one. I find myself, by the strange machinations of fate and a persistent superior who finds my face uncluttered by agreeable expression, temporarily stationed in the capital. My world is now one of ledgers, stubborn granary overseers, and the fascinatingly petty corruption of the office of carpentry. It is, in its own way, as surreal as yours. I have seen a man argue for an hour over the percentage of sand and mortar for a storehouse that will hold turnips. The fate of the turnips seemed to hang in the balance. How does one navigate a world where a turnip's dignity is a matter of bureaucratic debate? I, lacking your gift for metaphor, simply note it down and ensure the mortar is adequate. Sometimes a wall is just a wall, a comforting thought. I trust your eyes remain clear, and your smile, however you choose to paint it, remains your own. The engineer of neglected ditches. Akiko leaned against the cold wooden shelf, a laugh bubbling in her chest that was equal parts joy and hysterical relief. He was here. He was here, in this monstrous, beautiful city. And he saw it too. The absurdity, the pettiness, the terrifying, fragile construct of it all. His letter was a gulp of cold, clear water after months of drinking perfume sludge. She did not wait. That very afternoon, during the hour reserved for rest and reflection, which most use for frantic gossip, she hid in a disused alcove near the library. Using her simplest brush and ink, she wrote on a piece of her own, unperfumed practice paper. To the engineer of neglected ditches. Your report on turnip mortar diplomacy is the most sensible thing I have heard in months. The porcelain house rattles indeed, but the noise is mostly the sound of people gently clinking their own teeth together in faux smiles. The paintings on the fans grow more elaborate, the scenes more borrowed. Sometimes I fear we have all forgotten there is a hand that holds the fan, let alone a face behind it. Your metaphor is apt. A wall is just a wall, but here they would debate the philosophical implications of the brick, the social standing of the mason, and the seasonal appropriateness of the wall shadow for 7 hours, and then have someone assassinated over the choice of lintel. My smile is practiced. It is a tool, but I remember the taste of rain and honest conversation. It helps. How are the real ditches? Do they hold water? It seems a noble pursuit. The observer, who is trying very hard not to become just another shadow on the screen. She bribed a young, good-natured page who ran errands between the ministries with a few precious coins, giving him strict instructions to deliver it to a clerk named Tsutomu in the Ministry of Popular Affairs. The risk was immense if the letter was intercepted, but the need to connect, to be real with someone, was greater. His reply came 2 days later, hidden inside a bland scroll of grain yield reports that was delivered to the palace kitchens by mistake. A mistake she suspected he engineered. Observer. The real ditches are a mess. They hold water, mud, the occasional discarded sandal, and the towering indifference of the local gentry. It is profoundly, dirtily real. I am up to my knees in it tomorrow, and I shall think of your world of lintel assassinations with perverse nostalgia. You speak of the hand holding the fan. Never forget your own hand, Akiko. It can hold a fan, but it could also, I suspect, sketch a very competent diagram. Do not let them convince you that you are only the painting. You are the painter and the holder and the breath that moves the air. Your last line troubles me. Do not try hard. Just be. Even if being is, for now, a brilliantly executed performance of being a shadow, the best performances have a truth in them. Find yours. P.S. The maple viewing ceremony at the Oi River is in 10 days. A dreadful crush of people all pretending to be spontaneously moved by nature. A perfect place for a shadow to get momentarily lost in the crowd. If you were to find yourself near the third lantern post upstream from the main pavilion in the late afternoon, you might find a fellow appreciator of walls, ditches, and unborrowed scenes. The engineer. Akiko read the letter 3 times, then carefully burned it in the small charcoal brazier used for heating ink. The ashes were just ashes. No scent, no hidden meaning, just a fact. He had called her by her name, not mistress, not lady, Akiko. And he had asked to see her, a secret meeting. It was madness. It was a scandal that could destroy her and doom Lady Ume. It was also a lifeline. For the next 10 days, the court's rituals felt different. They were no longer just a minefield. They were a dance she had to perform flawlessly to earn a moment of freedom. She moved through poetry gatherings, scent-choosing sessions, and endless garment consultations with a new detached precision. She was a clockwork mechanism, winding itself towards a single point. She studied the plans for the maple viewing ceremony. It was a massive public event. The court would occupy a series of pavilions, but the banks of the river would be thronged with lesser nobles, officials, and even wealthy commoners. In the shifting crowd, a lady-in-waiting, heavily veiled and hooded against the autumn wind, might go unnoticed, especially if she had a credible excuse. The day arrived, sharp and bright. The maples along the Oi River were a screaming fire of crimson and gold. The air was filled with the smell of dried leaves, roasting chestnuts, and the cloying sweetness of festival sweets. The imperial pavilions were clouds of colored silk and polite laughter. Akiko, as part of Lady Uma's modest retinue, was dressed in appropriately autumnal layers, maple leaf and sunlight over deep river stone. Her heart was a wild bird trapped beneath the 12 layers. As the official poetry recitals began in the main pavilion, a litany of predictable odes to foliage, Akiko leaned towards Ume. "My lady, the crowd and the scents. I feel a slight headache. Would it be permissible to take a short walk by the riverbank, away from the noise? I will stay within sight." Ume, her own eyes distant as she composed a verse in her head, nodded absently. "Do not go far. The world is not all poetry, little bird." If only you knew, Akiko thought. She slipped away from the retinue, pulling a simple dark veil over her elaborate headdress. She moved downstream, away from the densest crowds, her pulse pounding in her ears. Every figure seemed to watch her. Every laugh felt like a warning. She passed the first lantern post, then the second. The noise of the court faded, replaced by the rush of the river and the chatter of merchants and minor officials. And then she saw the third lantern post, and leaning against it, looking utterly out of place in his simple dark gray Karaginu robe, was Tsutomu. He wasn't looking at the maples. He was studying the fastening of the lantern to its post with a technical frown. As she approached, he turned, and his face broke into a warm, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. No black teeth, no veil of polite mystery. Just a man, pleased to see her. "You came," he said, his voice low but clear over the river's noise. "You doubted?" she replied, stopping a few feet away, the veil between them. "I doubted the fan would have the courage to leave the painting," he said. "I am glad to be wrong." They stood for a moment, the world receding. Here there was no language of fans or scents, just two people by a river. "It's worse than I thought," she blurted out, the words escaping like held breath. "The rituals, they're not just for show. They're a skin. And underneath..." "Underneath is what?" he asked gently, his smile fading into concern. She couldn't tell him about the doll and the needle. Not here. Not yet. "Underneath is very dark," she said finally. "And very old. Your porcelain house is haunted, Tsutomu-sama." He nodded slowly, not dismissing her. "I believe you. I see the ghosts in the daylight. The greed in the minister's eyes, the fear in the courtiers. It's a different kind of ditch." He glanced around. "We don't have long. Tell me one true thing, something from inside," she thought. "The poetry is beautiful, and it is almost always a lie, a beautiful, careful lie." "And your?" he asked. "The poem about the fan?" "That," she said, and a real small smile touched her own lips beneath the veil, "was a question. It's the only weapon I have." "It's a good one," he said. "Keep asking." He reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small wrapped object, a gift for the observer. She took it. It was a smooth river stone, flat and gray. On one side, he had drawn in fine, indelible ink a tiny, perfect diagram of a water wheel. Simple, efficient, real. To remind you, he said, of walls and ditches and things that are what they are. She clasped the stone, its solid, cool weight a profound comfort. Thank you. A call echoed from the direction of the pavilions, a courtier summoning a group. Their time was up. Be careful, Akiko, he said, his voice earnest. Your questions make you dangerous to them. I know, she whispered. He bowed, not a court bow, but a sincere nod of farewell, and melted into the crowd moving upstream. Akiko stood for another minute, the stone warm in her palm, watching the brilliant dying leaves swirl on the surface of the river. Then she turned and walked back towards the pavilions, towards the borrowed scenes and the shadow play. But the weight in her hand was not a fan. It was an anchor. And for the first time since arriving in Heian, she did not feel entirely adrift. She had a secret. She had an ally. And she had a stone that held the blueprint of a simpler, truer world. The game was still deadly, but she was no longer playing with just the pieces she had been given. She had just introduced one of her own. Part 4. The Garden of Advancing Shadows. The stone was a secret heart, beating a slow, steady rhythm against her own frantic one. Akiko kept it wrapped in a scrap of plain cloth, tucked into the innermost fold of her robes, where the 12 layers hid it from the world. In the suffocating quiet of the palace, her fingers would find its smooth, cool surface, tracing the tiny inked lines of the water wheel. A wall is just a wall, a ditch is just a ditch. The mantra was a ward against the pervasive, whispering madness, but the stone could not silence the new fear that had taken root since the maple viewing ceremony. The meeting with Tsutomu had been a flash of lightning in a twilight world, brilliant, clarifying, and leaving behind a deeper dark. She had seen the spy, not during the meeting itself. As she had walked back towards the imperial pavilions, her face carefully schooled into the placid mask of a lady who had merely taken a turn for her health. A flicker of movement had caught her eye. Near a vendor's stall selling roasted nuts, half hidden by the smoke, stood a young man in the livery of a mid-level palace guard. He was not looking at the nuts. His gaze was fixed on the spot by the third lantern post where she had just stood, and then it tracked, with slow deliberation, to Tsutomu's retreating back. His face was expressionless, but his posture was one of a hunter who has just marked 2 birds with 1 stone. He did not look at her. He didn't need to. The damage was done. The following days were an exercise in controlled terror. Every footstep in the corridor outside her room made her start. Every summons from a senior lady sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She expected the accusation, the exposure, the ruin, but nothing happened. The palace hummed along with its usual poisonous grace. The silence was more terrifying than any outcry. It meant the knowledge was being held, savored, weaponized. Lady Fuji was not one for hasty strikes. She would let the fear mature, let it rot from the inside. Akiko was living on borrowed time, and the interest was compound fear. It was in this state of heightened dread that the second blow fell. Lady took to her bed. It began as a slight chill, a weariness that even her usual melancholy could not explain. Then came the headaches that made her wince at the light filtering through the paper screens. Her appetite vanished. Within 3 days, a low, relentless fever had set in, leaving her skin clammy and her eyes glittering with an unnatural brightness. She complained of nightmares, vivid, terrifying visions of faceless figures whispering from the corners of her room, of her own reflection in the bronze mirror smiling with black, needle-like teeth. "It is just the autumn malaise, my lady," the court physician announced after a perfunctory examination. His nostrils flared as if offended by the illness itself. He prescribed a broth of ginseng and chrysanthemum petals. "Rest and quiet contemplation." But Akiko, who changed the cooling cloths on Ume's forehead and read to her in a low voice, knew it was not just anything. The symptoms were textbook, not of any physical ailment in the physician's scrolls, but of the tales whispered in servant quarters and old wives' warnings. Mono no ke, a spirit possession, a curse. The evidence was in the details. Ume's personal comb, made of fine boxwood, was found one morning with 3 teeth snapped clean off. A jar of her favorite mist over the lake incense, when opened, released a foul, sulfurous odor that made the maid gag. And one evening, as Akiko adjusted the lamp, she saw it clearly. On the pale skin of Ume's throat, just below her ear, 3 faint, bruised marks in a perfect small triangle, like the imprint of sharp, inhuman fingers. The palace's reaction was a masterpiece of veiled panic. Visits from well-wishing ladies became brief, conducted from a respectful distance, their faces masked by fans and concern. Gifts of fruit and sympathetic poems arrived, but Akiko noticed the careful selection: peaches for longevity and sprigs of sacred sakaki wood for purification. They were not get-well presents, they were amulets. The message was clear. Lady Ume was under spiritual attack, and no one wanted the contamination to spread. The atmosphere in Ume's chambers grew thick with unsaid things. The other attendants began to find excuses to be elsewhere. Only Akiko and Ume's old, loyal nurse remained. The silence was broken by Ume's feverish mumblings and the occasional, heart-wrenching whimper of pure fear. "They are in the walls," Ume whispered one night, her hand clutching Akiko's with a desperate strength. "They are singing my name. It sounds like cracking ice." Akiko felt a fury rise in her, cold and clear. This was not a political maneuver. This was an eradication. Someone, and she had no doubt who, was not content with social ruin. They were aiming for soul death. The curse in the pavilion had not been a generic act of malice. It had a target, and the arrow had found its mark. She could not go to the authorities. The official onmyoji, the yin-yang masters who served the court, were deeply political creatures. Many were known to be in Lady Fuji's pocket. To report a curse would be to invite an investigation that would either whitewash it or, worse, twist it to implicate Ume, or even Akiko herself, in some dark practice. The system, as Tsutomu had said, was not designed to fix problems. It was designed to manage them, often by sacrificing the weakest piece. She needed help from outside the porcelain house. Someone who understood real shadows and not just painted ones. The answer came to her, whispered on the same currents of servant gossip that carried tales of curses. Abe no Seimei. The name was spoken in hushed tones, a blend of awe and fear. He was an onmyoji, but not like the court ones. He was said to be half kitsune, a fox spirit, born of a human father and a celestial fox mother. He was blind, they said, his eyes milky white, but he could see the flow of ki, the threads of fate, and the true forms of demons. He lived on the outskirts of the city, shunning court patronage, serving those who sought him out with strange, practical problems. Fields that would not yield, wells that turned bitter, children plagued by night terrors. He was a fixer of supernatural leaks, a mechanic for haunted machinery. He was also, by all accounts, utterly terrifying and notoriously difficult to find. It was the most reckless idea she had ever entertained, to seek out a marginal, possibly mad mystic. Yet the alternative was to watch Ume waste away, consumed by a darkness Akiko had witnessed being conjured. The stone in her sash felt heavy. A ditch is just a ditch, but this was a ditch poisoning the one person who had shown her kindness. It needed to be cleaned. She needed a way out of the palace. The illness provided it. "My lady needs a specific herb for the fever," she told the senior chamberlain, her voice a model of subservient worry. "The court physician's stock is old. I know of a shop in the city that imports fresh materials from Ki province. With a guard, I could fetch it before nightfall." The chamberlain, eager to have the problem of the cursed chambers dealt with at a distance, agreed with surprising haste. He assigned her a single bored-looking guard, likely as glad to get out of the oppressive atmosphere as she was. The ride in a closed palanquin through the streets of Heian was a disorientation. After months of sealed corridors and raked gardens, the assault of smells, smoke, sewage, roasting fish, human sweat, was overwhelming. The sounds were a cacophony of hawkers' cries, arguing neighbors, the clatter of looms. It was filthy, vibrant, and achingly real. She peered through the bamboo slats, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She directed the palanquin to a reputable herbalist she had heard Ume mention. There she purchased a bundle of innocuous feverfew and ginkgo leaves, performing the errand with visible diligence for the guard's benefit. Then as they were about to turn back, she pressed a hand to her forehead. "Oh, I feel quite faint from the journey and the worry," she murmured to the guard. "There is a small, quiet shrine just down that lane, dedicated to the healing Buddha. May I stop for a moment to pray and compose myself? You may wait at the gate. I will be but a few minutes." The guard, seeing no threat in a shrine and likely wanting to avoid the drama of a fainting noblewoman, nodded. Akiko, clutching her package of herbs, slipped through the weathered wooden gate. The shrine was tiny and empty. She did not stop. She walked straight through its little garden and out a back gate that opened onto a narrow, muddy lane, exactly as the herbalist's apprentice, well-tipped, had told her she would. She had traded her outer, identifiable layer of maple leaf and sunlight for a drab brown servant's cloak she had smuggled beneath her robes. She pulled the hood up, hiding her face in the distinctive blackened teeth. Now she was just another shadow in the city's underbelly. Following a chain of whispered directions bought with more coins, she moved through a labyrinth of increasingly poorer districts. The grand symmetrical avenues of the imperial city gave way to a tangled mess of leaning houses, open drains, and suspicious glances. The air smelled of damp rot and cheap charcoal. Finally, in a lane that seemed little more than a gap between two crumbling walls, she found the place. It was not a temple or a grand house. It was a simple, weathered wooden dwelling, slightly larger than the hovels around it, but remarkable for its utter stillness. No weeds grew at its base, no birds perched on its roof. The silence around it was a palpable bubble, pushing back the noise of the city. The only marking was a faded paper charm, a shide, hanging above the door, its zigzag cutouts stirring in no wind Akiko could feel. Her courage almost failed her. This was the threshold of the unknown in a very literal sense. Clutching the stone in her pocket, she stepped forward and knocked, the sound absurdly small against the heavy door. It swung open silently, revealing not a servant, but the man himself. Abe no Saimai was neither old nor young. He had a lean, ageless face, sharp-featured and intelligent. His hair was pure white, tied back simply. And his eyes, they were open, but saw nothing of the material world. They were the color of clouded quartz, fixed on a point just beyond her left shoulder. He wore plain, dark blue robes, no different from a minor clerk's. "You are late," he said. His voice was dry, precise, without warmth, but also without malice. "The imbalance has been deepening for 9 days. Come in. You are letting the confusion of the street inside." Stunned, Akiko stepped over the threshold. The interior was stark, clean, and intensely ordered. Scrolls of astronomy and geomancy were neatly stacked. Strange instruments of brass and wood sat on shelves. In the center of the single room, a brazier glowed, with a low, blue-tinged flame that gave no smoke. The air smelled of ozone and dried mugwort. You were expecting me," she stammered, forgetting all courtly etiquette. "A ripple in the Kotodama, the spirit of words, reaches even here," Simai said, moving to kneel by the brazier with an unerring grace. A poem was spoken that asked a real question. It created a small, clean space in the murk. I felt it. Then more recently, a much uglier sound, the tearing of a soul fabric. The two disturbances are connected. By you. Sit. She knelt opposite him, feeling laid bare. His blind eyes seemed to see straight through the servant's cloak, the 12 layers, the practiced smiles to the frightened, furious girl within. My lady, Lady Ume, is ill. It is not a natural illness. Describe the symptoms, not the physical ones, the other ones. Haltingly, Akiko told him. The nightmares, the broken comb, the spoiled incense, the finger marks. She told him of the oppressive feeling in the chambers, the retreat of the other attendants. She did not mention Lady Fuji or the pavilion. Not yet. Seimei listened, his head tilted as if hearing a faint, distant melody. When she finished, he nodded once. Mononoke, a possessing spirit, but one recently bound and directed, a crafted thing, an Onryo puppet. He reached a hand out over the brazier, his long fingers splayed. The blue flame seemed to lean towards his palm. The source is close. Its roots are in envy, its structure in ritual. It is a weed growing in a garden of poison. He turned his clouded eyes directly towards her, and Akiko felt a shock, as if he could see her soul. You have seen the gardener. You carry the chill of that sight with you. It sits behind your ribs, next to your little stone. Akiko's breath caught. He knew. He knew everything. The last of her defenses crumbled. In a rushed, hushed whisper, she told him of the night in the pavilion, of Lady Fuji, the doll, the needle, the incantation. Seimei's expression did not change. Fuji, he said, tasting the name, a mountain that is cold at the summit and hides fire within. Fitting. The ritual was a katashiro transfer, moving malice into a vessel linked to the target. Crude but effective for short-range malice. The broken comb, the spoiled scent, these are the spirit's claws gaining purchase. The marks on the throat are its teeth. Soon it will not just haunt her dreams, it will stop her breath. Can you stop it? The question was a plea. I can, Seimei said simply, but I will not. Despair washed over Akiko. Why? I can pay. Somehow. You misunderstand, he interrupted, his voice like a scalpel. If I go to the palace and perform an exorcism, it will be a battle. It will be seen. It will be political. It will make me a tool in their game, and it will make your lady a permanent target. The gardener will simply plant a new, sharper weed. No. To pull a weed, you must remove the root, and for that, you need different tools. What tools? Knowledge, he said. You wish to protect your lady? Then you must learn to see the strings that move the puppet. You must learn to snip them yourself. He was offering to teach her. Not court magic, not the pretty superstitions of charms and lucky directions. Real magic, the physics of the unseen world. I am a woman of the court, she said, hearing the weakness of the protest even as she said it. You are a person who asked a real question, he countered. That is rarer than any title. Your spirit is not yet fully lacquered over. There is still a grip for a tool. Will you take it up, or will you watch your friend die? There was no choice. It was the ditch that needed cleaning. I will learn, she said, her voice firm. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Seimei's lips. Good. We have little time. Lesson 1. Everything is connected. The spirit afflicting your lady is tethered to the doll, which is tethered to the one who made it, who is herself tethered to her ambitions, her fears, her physical possessions. To weaken the spirit, we weaken the tether. How? Sympathy and antipathy, he said. He gestured to a shelf. Bring me the box of ash. She found a small lacquer box filled with a fine, silvery ash. Willow ash, Seimei explained as she placed it before him. The tree of flexibility and water. It opposes the rigid, fiery malice of the crafted Onryo. From his sleeve, he produced a small, sharp knife. Your hair. Without hesitation, Akiko leaned forward and let him snip a single, long strand from her head. Then, to her surprise, he pricked his own thumb with the knife, letting a single drop of blood fall onto the ash. He mixed it with the hair, whispering words too low for her to hear. The ash seemed to shimmer for a moment. This is not a charm to bring luck, he said, handing her the box. It is a counter-irritant, a distraction. Tonight, when you are alone with her, sprinkle this ash in a thin line across the threshold of her sleeping chamber. Then around her bed, sprinkle a circle of salt, common salt from the kitchens. The salt is a wall, the ash is a path leading away from it. The spirit will be repelled by the wall and attracted by the scent of the ash, which now carries the taste of a living, willful soul mixed with my own Dakai. It will follow that scent away from her, back along its own tether, towards its source. It will cause confusion, a hiccup in the curse. It will buy us days, perhaps a week of clarity for her and of irritation for the gardener. What will it do to the gardener? Nothing harmful, a nightmare, a sense of being watched, a foul taste in the mouth, small things. But in a world built on poise, small disturbances can be revealing. His blind eyes seem to gleam. It will tell her that the field is not uncontested. Lesson 2. The best defense is not a shield, but a mirror. Akiko took the box as if it held live coals. This was real. This was active. Come back when the moon is dark, Seimei said, dismissing her. We will discuss tethers and how to find the knot and bring better questions. She found her way back to the shrine, her mind reeling. The guard was dozing at the gate. The return to the palace was a blur. That night, under the cover of darkness, while the old nurse slept, she did as Seimei instructed. She laid the line of silvery ash. She circled the bed with stolen salt. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Ume, who had been tossing in feverish sleep, let out a soft sigh and stilled. The grimace of pain on her face smoothed. The frantic movement of her eyes beneath her lids ceased. She sank into a deep, natural sleep. The oppressive weight in the room, which Akiko had almost grown used to, lifted so suddenly she felt dizzy. The air felt clean. At the same moment, in a far more luxurious wing of the palace, a report was being delivered in hushed tones. The spy from the maple viewing ceremony stood before Lady Fuji. The engineer is one Tsutomu, a junior official in the Ministry of Popular Affairs. Ambitious, but with unorthodox views, his patronage is weak. The girl is Fujiwara no Akiko, attendant to Lady Umi. She is sharper than she appears. They spoke by the river for less than 5 minutes. Lady Fuji, sipping her tea, said nothing. Her expression was one of mild interest. And today, the spy continued, the girl went to the city on an errand. She visited the herbalist, then a shrine. But she was seen later, in a servant's cloak, entering the lane of Abe no Seimei. She stayed for half an hour. At this, Lady Fuji's cup halted halfway to her lips. A vertical line appeared between her perfectly drawn brows. Seimei, she repeated, the name a sour note. The blind fox. That is interesting. She set her cup down with a precise click. The situation? The illness holds, no change. Watch them both, Lady Fuji said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. The engineer and the girl, and find out what exactly the fox told his new little cub. As the spy bowed and retreated, Lady Fuji rose and walked to her own pristine veranda. She looked out at her perfectly ordered garden, but her mind was elsewhere. A slight, inexplicable shudder passed through her, as if a cold finger had traced her spine. She attributed it to the night air and shrugged it off, but the taste in her mouth was suddenly, unaccountably bitter. Part 5. The Ritual of Reflecting Evil. The world under Seimei's tutelage became a different kind of poem. Not one composed of elegant allusions and seasonal references, but a raw, pulsing epic written in scent, texture, taste, and the invisible currents that move between all things. For Akiko, it was like being taught to read all over again, in a language that was brutally, uncomfortably literal. Her first true lesson after the ash and salt was not about incantations, but about mud. Here, Seimei said the next time she slipped into his austere dwelling on the dark of the moon. He thrust a rough clay bowl into her hands. It was filled with a viscous black sludge from the bed of the Kamo River. Describe it. Akiko, her nose wrinkling at the fetid organic smell, looked at him as if he were mad. It is mud, dirty water, and earth. Use your words, courtier, the ones you use for perfume and silk. Describe this. She swallowed, trying to find a metaphor. It is the color of midnight without stars. Its scent is the deep breath of decaying lotus. Its texture is... Stop! His milky eyes seemed to bore into her. It is not midnight. It is nitrogen, silt, rotting vegetation, and the excrement of waterfowl. Its smell is hydrogen sulfide and decomposition. Its texture is a specific density of particulate matter suspended in liquid. Poetry is a lens, a beautiful one, but it distorts. To see the truth, you must first learn to name the thing itself. Then, you can decide what it means. He made her taste it. Not the mud, but the lessons that followed. He lined up vials of crushed herbs, barks, and minerals. This is koyo mugwort. In a poem? It is the bitter ghost of summer fields, she ventured, recalling a line from an old anthology. In your mouth? Tentatively, she placed a few crushed leaves on her tongue. An intensely green, astringent bitterness exploded, followed by a cleansing, almost medicinal coolness. It was shocking, vivid, utterly unlike the idea of it. It is sharp, it clears the head. Good, and this? Bakugan, white sandalwood. The scent of sacred solitude, she recited. Taste it. The powdered wood was dry, slightly sweet, with a faint, numbing pungency. It is dusty. It makes my tongue feel still. It is an anchor. It grounds erratic energy. Remember the taste. The body remembers what the mind romanticizes. He was dismantling her world, brick by gilded brick. He taught her of kegari, spiritual pollution, not as a vague sin, but as a tangible residue. It could cling to places of violent death, to objects of great jealousy, to people radiating sustained malice. It was a sticky, dark energy that attracted lesser spirits in soured luck. The palace, he said dryly, was likely a symphony of kegari, each wing humming at a different pitch of resentment and fear. The practical applications were mundane and revolutionary. He taught her katashiro, the art of directional protection. It wasn't just about avoiding the unlucky northeast. It was about understanding that energy flowed like water or wind, and a simple paper cutout charged with intent and placed with geometric precision could act as a spiritual baffle or drain. Think of it as adjusting a gutter on a roof, he said, his hand swiftly folding a piece of white paper into a stylized human form. You cannot stop the rain of ill will, but you can divert it away from the vulnerable foundation. He showed her how to breathe a specific intention into the paper. Not a grand wish, but a clear, simple command like deflect or dissipate, and where to hide it, under a threshold in the rafters, tied to a tree facing the source of trouble. Her internal commentary was a constant, bewildered shriek. He just had me lick a rock that tasted like despair to identify malign earth energy. I have officially left the realm of acceptable hobbies for a noblewoman. This is worse than embroidery. Today's lesson, how to purify a room by clapping sharply in the four corners. The theory involves shocking stagnant kwai into motion. I feel like a demented seal. Lady would compose a devastatingly elegant poem about my decline. I now know 12 different types of protective salt circles. The wavering moon configuration is for slow, insidious curses. The falling star is for sudden attacks. My brain is a pantry for metaphysical seasonings. But alongside the absurdity, a new sense was waking up. Walking back to the palace through the teeming city, she began to feel the layers Saimi described. The cheerful, bustling chaos of a market had a bright, golden yellow hum. A narrow alley where a fight had recently occurred throbbed with a bruised, violet ache. The palace gates, when she approached them, did not just loom with institutional power, They pulsed with a deep, complicated indigo shot through with threads of sickly green and jagged red, the colors of ambition, envy, and secret violence. It was overwhelming, like hearing a cacophony of voices after a life of near silence. She used her new, fragile understanding to tend to Lady The ash and salt had worked. Fever broke, and the nightmares receded. She was weak, translucent as a moth's wing, but the clawing terror was gone. The court declared it a triumph of the physician's ginseng broth in pure heart. Akiko knew better, but the Kagari lingered in the room like a bad smell. The spiritual wound was still open, faintly weeping malice. Would never fully heal while it remained. She needed a true cleansing, a sealing of the breach. This went beyond simple protection. It required a ritual of active purification. And for that, Akiko needed to implement Seimei's most dangerous lesson yet. The strongest magic is not confrontation, he had told her, his blind face turned toward his perpetually blue brazier flame. It is reflection. A curse is a focused beam of poisoned intent. To block it requires great strength. To absorb it, great sacrifice. But to turn it back upon itself? He tapped the side of his empty cup. It rang with a clear, high note. That requires only perfect alignment and a polished surface. The ritual he described was deceptively simple. It required no rare ingredients, no dramatic incantations. It required timing, precision, and a vessel to act as the mirror. The vessel, he implied, looking directly through her, would be Akiko herself. The risk was absolute. Conducting any private ritual within the palace was forbidden. If she was caught, the punishment would be severe. If the ritual failed, she could make herself a target for the reflected curse, or worse, amplify it onto But to do nothing was to leave her patroness vulnerable to the next inevitable attack. Lady Fuji's bitterness had tasted her defiance in the ash. She would not wait long. Akiko chose a night when the moon was a thin, cold sliver, a time for endings and subtle works. She waited until the deepest watch, when even the palace's insomniac whispers had died down. In chamber, the lady slept a thin, quiet sleep. Akiko had already prepared the space over days. A tiny katashiro of mulberry paper tucked into the frame of the door to mute spiritual sounds. A sprinkle of purifying nadeshiko pollen along the windowsill. Now she took a bowl of fresh water from the purest well in the palace grounds. She placed it in the center of the room, where moonlight from a carefully adjusted screen fell upon it, creating a single bright ripple on the surface. This was her mirror, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was not a priestess. She was a girl with a stone in her sash and a head full of half-understood principles. But she remembered the taste of mugwort, clarity, the feel of sandalwood, stillness. She let those sensations fill her, pushing back the fear. She did not chant. Instead, she focused on the water, imagining its surface becoming not still, but infinitely deep and reflective. She thought of kindness, her quiet poetry, her genuine love for the fragile beauty of the world. She poured that feeling, like a silver liquid, into her conception of the water. This was the polished surface. Then she brought to mind the sensation of the room as it had been, the cloying fear, the pinprick bruises of spiritual violation, the sulfurous reek of hatred that had spoiled the incense. She did not fight this memory. She acknowledged it then, with a deliberate turn of her will, like angling a shield. She imagined this remembered miasma striking the surface of the silver-lit water. In her mind's eye, she saw the dark energy not sink in, but splash back, scattering, its own coherence shattered, reflected back along the path it had come. She held this image, this feeling of perfect, neutral deflection, until her muscles trembled and the sweat stood cold on her brow. A soft sound made her gasp. It was not a crash or a scream. It was the gentle ping of a single hanging copper ornament in the alcove, vibrating as if touched. The water in the bowl shivered, though no draft stirred the air. Then a sensation like a held breath finally being released washed through the room. The last clinging residue of dread lifted, vanishing so completely the air itself seemed brighter. In her sleep, sighed, a sound of profound, unburdened relief, and turned onto her side, a faint, natural color returning to her cheek. It had worked. The Kagar was gone. The spiritual wound was closed. Akiko slumped, dizzy with exhaustion and elation. She had done it. She had used real magic, not the painted kind. She had protected someone. For a moment she felt invincible. The feeling lasted until the next afternoon. A formal summons came, not for her, but for Lady to attend a minor tea ceremony hosted by Lady Fuji. It was a command disguised as an invitation. Still frail, had no choice but to go. Akiko attended her, a silent shadow. The ceremony was a masterpiece of chilling perfection. Lady Fuji presided like a glacier goddess, her movements flawless, her conversation a web of elegant barbs aimed at no one and everyone. Her eyes, when they passed over held a polite clinical interest. But when they flicked to Akiko, they lingered for a half-second too long. There was no anger, no surprise. Only a deep, recalculating scrutiny, as if a piece on a game board had just moved itself in an unexpected way. She said nothing to Akiko. She didn't need to. The message was in the weight of that look. "I see you." The counterstroke came not at Akiko directly, but from a perpendicular angle. 2 days later, a bureaucratic edict filtered down from the highest levels of the Ministry of Central Affairs to the lowly Ministry of Popular Affairs. It concerned a pressing need for oversight of grain storage and levee systems in the remote, restive province of Mutsu in the far north. The mission was deemed crucial, difficult, and perilously close to the lands of the unconquered Emishi. The official selected for this honor, a testament to his diligence and potential for future promotion, was Tsutomu. It was a beautifully lethal move. It was not a demotion. It was a promotion to a graveyard of ambitions. Mutsu was where promising bureaucrats were sent to be forgotten, or to die from frontier diseases, banditry, or sheer bureaucratic loneliness. The assignment was for a minimum of 3 years. It was a death sentence for his career at court, and possibly for him. Akiko learned of it through the palace gossip network, which buzzed with the news of the upstart engineer's surprising appointment. She felt the world drop out from beneath her. This was the price. She had reflected the curse, and Lady Fuji, sensing the interference, had simply moved to remove a piece she now saw as connected. Tsutomu was being erased for the crime of having spoken by a river with a girl who dared to learn the taste of mugwort. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. She had saved only to doom Tsutomu. The victory tasted of ashes. Somehow, a message from him found its way to her, slipped into a bundle of new writing brushes delivered to chambers. It was brief, written in his hurried, practical script. Observer. It seems I am to study the ditches of the north, a formidable task. The walls there are reportedly very solid and very cold. I am to leave in 5 days. I would see the Gardener of Shadows one last time, if she is willing to risk it. The usual place, at the hour of the boar. The engineer, bound for frozen foundations. He was giving her a choice, a final, reckless chance. She knew it was a trap waiting to be sprung, that Lady Fuji's spies would be watching him and her more closely than ever. To meet was to confirm his guilt in her eyes and paint a target on Akiko's back that no Katashiro could deflect. She went. The night was clear and bitingly cold. She wore the drab servant's cloak, her face shrouded. The city streets were empty, the silence broken only by the distant bark of a dog or the call of a watchman. The third lantern post by the Oi River stood like a sentinel in the darkness, the water a black ribbon whispering below. He was already there, a tall, still shape against the night. He turned as she approached, and even in the gloom, she saw the strain on his face. the grim set of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice rough. "Neither should you," she replied, stopping before him. The space between them felt charged, electric with everything unsaid. "Mutsu," he said, the word hanging in the cold air like a ghost. "It's because of me," she whispered, the guilt of physical pain. "It's because of her," he corrected sharply, "because she fears something she doesn't understand. A man who looks at foundations, and a woman who asks real questions. We are inconvenient truths." He stepped closer. "I am not afraid of the North, Akiko. I am afraid of leaving you here, in her web, alone." The sound of her name on his lips, here in the darkness, undid her. The courtly pretense, the layers of defense, all fell away. "I am learning," she said, the words tumbling out. "Not just to survive, to see, to do things. From a man who is not of the court, Saimai." He understood instantly. A flicker of awe crossed his face, followed by deeper worry. "Then you are in more danger than I imagined, and more powerful." He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cold cheek. The touch was a brand. "I will come back. I will navigate their frozen ditches, and I will come back. For my reforms, and for you." It was a vow made against all reason, against the crushing machinery of the court. It was the most beautiful, impossible thing she had ever heard. In this world of borrowed scenes and shadow play, she wanted one true thing to hold on to. "Then let us make a promise," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Not a court contract, not a political alliance, a real one." From a small pouch at her waist, she drew out the sharp little knife Sime had used for the ash ritual. Without a word, she gathered a long lock of her own, ink-black hair, and sawed through it. She held the severed strand out to him, a silken ribbon in the moonlight. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He took the knife from her, unbound his own top knot, a thing no respectable man would do in public, and cut a lock of his own dark hair. His hands were steady. They stood facing each other. Then, with a reverence that felt more sacred than any shrine ritual, they entwined the two locks together, his and hers, weaving them into a single, inseparable cord. The act was intimate beyond words, a binding of fates. "By the water that carries all truth," Tsutomu murmured. "By the earth that holds all foundations," Akiko responded. Together they knelt at the river's edge. For a moment they held the braided lock between them, a tangible symbol of a bond that had no name in the court's lexicon. Then, with a simultaneous release, they let it fall onto the dark, swift-moving water. It lingered for a second, a dark smudge on the shimmering black, then was caught by the current and swept away, heading inexorably north, carrying their promise with it. They stood, the space between them now hollow with impending loss. No embrace, no kiss. Such things belonged to a world of less consequence. This was something else, a merging of wills. "I will be your eyes in the north," he said. "Write to me of the porcelain house. I will write to you of real walls. And I will learn," she vowed, "how to protect our ground." A distant sound, a cart rattling on a far-off street, made them start. Their time was up. With a last long look that tried to memorize every line of each other's face, they parted. He turned and walked north along the river, without looking back. She turned south toward the palace, the taste of mugwort and loss sharp on her tongue. In her chamber, hours later, the cold stone from the riverbed was in her hand. The diagram of the water wheel was almost worn away from her constant touching, but it didn't matter. She had woven a new diagram now, one of hair and water and promise. The ritual of reflection had saved Umi. The ritual of the braided lock had given her a reason to fight on. But as she lay in the darkness, she felt a new, different kind of kagari settling around her heart. Not the sticky residue of malice, but the clean, cold ache of absence. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the winter air, that Lady Fuji's game was far from over. She had merely finished the opening moves. Part 6. Weaving the Net. The silence after Tsutomu left was a physical presence. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room, but the hollow, echoing silence of a plucked string, vibrating with an absence that was louder than any sound. Akiko moved through her days in the palace like a ghost through familiar halls, each step a conscious effort. The stone in her sash was her talisman, but the braided lock of hair, now carried in a small silk pouch next to it, was her wound. She had let the current take it north, but the memory of its weight in her hand was a constant, aching pull in the direction he had gone. Lady Fuji did not let her grieve. The attack, when it came, was not a single dramatic blow. It was 1,000 paper cuts, a slow, meticulous unraveling of her standing, her sanity, and her safety. It began in the realm where the court lived and breathed. Gossip. The whispers started as delicate as the first frost, too faint to pinpoint. Akiko would enter a room and conversation would stutter, then resume with unnatural brightness. She would catch fragments as she passed screens, or too clever by half, to provincial manners will out. Attached to poor Ume, of course, but one wonders about her influence. The words were never direct, never attributable. They were miasma, a kagar of reputation. Then came the first tangible blow. A poem written on paper of a provocatively passionate plum blossom pink and scented with clove. The scent of direct proposition was found tucked among Lady Ume's incoming correspondence. It was addressed to no one, but the handwriting, with an artful, deliberate clumsiness, bore a passing resemblance to Akiko's early, unpolished script. The verse was blatant, crude. The northern wind may blow so cold, yet in my secret heart, a fire. For one who speaks of walls and gears is all my deepest, fond desire. It was a masterpiece of slander. It implied an illicit passion for a low-born engineer, named his profession, and mocked his pragmatic speech. It painted Akiko as not just lovesick, but tasteless and indiscreet. The poem miraculously found its way into the hands of the mistress of attendants before Akiko could intercept it. Summoned, Akiko stood before the stern-faced woman. The poem lay on the table between them like a dead, poisonous insect. This was found among your lady's papers. Do you know anything of it? Akiko kept her gaze at the approved waist level, her face a calm mask. Inside, cold fury battled with terror. I do not, my lady. The handwriting is an imitation, and poor one. The scent is clove. I use only aloes wood or lotus, as is appropriate for Lady Ume's household. This is meant to cause harm. To whom? To you? Or to Lady Ume through you? The mistress's eyes were sharp. She was no friend of Lady Fuji, but she was a guardian of protocol. Such a breach, if true, could see you sent home in disgrace. Consider your position fragile. Fujiwara no Akiko. The walls have ears, and the screens have eyes. It was a warning, not a conviction. The mistress clearly suspected a frame-up, but in the court, suspicion was often enough. The damage was done. The story of the clove-scented plea to an engineer spread, adding a salacious layer to the existing whispers. The next attack was more intimate. Akiko's personal cosmetics, stored in a small lacquered box, were sabotaged. Her white face powder, when she went to apply it one morning, had been mixed with a fine irritant dust that made her skin redden and itch. Her precious vial of lotus perfume, a gift from Ume, had been diluted with cheap, fishy-smelling oil. These were not the acts of a grand sorceress, but of a petty, malicious intruder, likely a bribed maid. It was a violation that screamed, I can touch what is yours. You are not safe, even in your own space. Lady Ume, still regaining her strength, watched with sad, knowing eyes. She is testing you, Ume murmured one afternoon as Akiko tried to soothe her irritated skin with a plain cream. Like a cat with a mouse. She wants to see you run, or cry, or lash out blindly. What should I do? Akiko asked, the helplessness a bitter taste. Ume looked at her. a flicker of the old poetic fire in her gaze. You have learned to ask real questions. Ask one of her, but do it in a language she understands. It was the permission she needed. The time for passive survival was over. She was in the serpent's lair, and she would not be swallowed whole. She would become a thorn in its gullet. Her counterattack began with the only currency she had, poetry. She composed a series of short, razor-sharp tanka and released them into the gossip stream, not under her name, but as anonymous, floating verses that seemed to come from nowhere. They were satires aimed at the absurdities of court life, but with a specific biting edge. One about a painted fan that critiques the wind for moving was widely understood to mock the hypocrisy of those who enforced rules they themselves manipulated. Another, describing a garden stone that dreams it is a mountain, poked fun at pretentiousness and misplaced ambition. They were clever, just oblique enough to avoid direct accusation, but pointed enough that people started to look around, wondering who had the wit and the nerve to write them. The verses took on a life of their own, quoted with snickers behind fans. They didn't name Lady Fuji, but they chipped away at the atmosphere of unquestioned authority she cultivated. Next, she used Saime's lessons. The sabotage of her cosmetics was a spiritual violation, as well as a physical one. It left a residue of petty malice, a kagare of envy. Instead of just cleansing it, Akiko decided to reflect it, as she had with the curse on Ume, but in a more subtle, tracking way. She took the contaminated face powder. To it, she added 3 drops of her own saliva, a link to herself, a pinch of salt from the palace kitchens, purification and grounding, and a single coiled thread plucked from the hem of a robe worn by a known gossip from Lady Fuji's circle, a sympathetic link to the source of the malice. She mixed it not with intention of harm, but with the clear, focused will of return. She whispered over it, not an incantation, but a direct statement. Let the ill will see its own face. Then she carefully sprinkled the mixture in a continuous, thin line from the base of her door, out into the corridor, and towards the servants' quarters, the path a saboteur would likely take. It was a reverse katashiro. Instead of deflecting energy away, it was designed to create a faint, sympathetic echo back to its originator. Saime had spoken of such things as karma strings, invisible threads that connected action to consequence. She was plucking one. The effect was not dramatic, but 2 days later, the gossip he made from Lady Fuji's circle developed a sudden, inexplicable rash on her hands, hands that might have handled tainted powder. The girl was sent from court in shame, her condition deemed unclean. A small victory, but a telling one. It proved the sabotage could be traced. It made the hidden physical war visible. Akiko also began to cultivate her own network. She was not rich, but she had access to Ume's diminishing store of kindness. She used it strategically. To the old nurse who loved Ume dearly, she showed unwavering loyalty and extra help, earning a fierce, silent protectiveness. To the young page who had carried her first message to Tsutomu, she offered small coins and, more importantly, respect, treating him as a person, not furniture. To a disgruntled junior scribe in the Ministry of Popular Affairs, frustrated by the corruption that had sent a capable man like Tsutomu north, she sent anonymous, encouraging verses about upright pillars and clear water. She was planting seeds, tiny sources of information and goodwill in barren soil. She was no longer just a target. She was a player, learning the board, moving her few pieces with care. The transformation was internal but visible. Her shoulders lost their defensive hunch. Her gaze, while still demure, held a new, watchful depth. She moved through the palace not as a frightened ghost, but as a wary, intelligent animal in a dangerous wood. It was this new observant Akiko who found the crack in Lady Fuji's glacial facade. The clue came from an unexpected source: music. The Gagaku Court Orchestra was rehearsing for an upcoming autumn festival. Akiko, on an errand, passed the open-sided pavilion where they practiced. The complex, ancient melodies wove through the air, at once stately and strangely haunting. As she paused, listening, she saw her. Lady Fuji was seated in a shaded corner of a nearby veranda, partially hidden by a large painted screen. She was alone. Her posture was as perfect as ever, but there was an unnerving stillness to it. She was not merely listening, she was absorbed. Her head was tilted slightly, her fan motionless in her lap, and her eyes were fixed on one musician in particular, a young flautist. He was beautiful in a way that was uncommon at court. His beauty was not refined or powdered, it was sharp, wild, with a faint, untamed air. His fingers flew over the bamboo flute, his whole body swaying with the plaintive melody. He played with a passion that was almost indecent in its sincerity. Akiko watched Lady Fuji watch him, and she saw it, a fleeting, naked hunger that crossed the older woman's face before the shutters of control slammed down again. It was there for less than a heartbeat, a look of desperate, possessive longing. Then it was gone, replaced by the usual impassive mask. But Akiko had seen it. The great Lady Fuji, mistress of intrigue, pillar of icy propriety, was secretly, deeply infatuated with a low-born musician. The power of the knowledge was so immense, it was terrifying. This was not just a weakness, it was a suicidal vulnerability. For a high-born lady, especially a married one of Fuji's stature, such a feeling was unthinkable. For it to be directed at a mere musician, a man of no family, was social catastrophe. If exposed, it would not just ruin her, it would erase her. It was a weapon of absolute destruction. Akiko stored the knowledge away, a secret more dangerous than any cursed doll. She did not know how or if she would ever use it, but its mere existence changed the balance of power in her mind. The serpent had a hidden, soft underbelly. She was pondering this, walking through an inner garden late one afternoon, when she heard the commotion. A messenger, spattered with mud and wild-eyed, was being ushered urgently toward the minister's quarters. His words gasped to the guards, sliced through the autumn air like a knife. Ambush on the Mutsu Road? The official party, bandits or maybe Akudo, scattered. The junior minister, Tsutomu, missing, presumed dead or taken. The world did not go dark, it went white. A blinding, silent whiteness that erased the garden, the palace, the sky. Akiko stood frozen, the words echoing in the void where her mind had been. Missing, presumed dead. The carefully constructed walls of her new strength crumbled to dust. The strategic mind, the poetic barbs, the subtle magic, all of it was meaningless. The northern wind had blown, and it had blown out her fire. She didn't remember moving, but she found herself in the seclusion of a bamboo grove, away from prying eyes. She sank to her knees, the rough stalks digging into her skin. No tears came. There was only a vast, howling emptiness, a ditch inside her so deep and cold, no light could reach the bottom. The stone in her sash was a lump of meaningless rock. The pouch with the braided hair was a mockery. He was gone, the one real thing. The promise on the river had been swept away, not toward a future, but into a void. Time lost meaning. She knelt there as the white shock slowly thawed into a pain so acute it was physical, a blade turning in her chest. The network she was weaving, the game she was learning to play, what was it for, if the future it was meant to protect had just vanished? A soft rustle made her look up, though she did not care who saw her desolation. It was the old nurse, Uma's nurse. Her wrinkled face was grave. She crouched with an old woman's grunt, not touching Akiko, but her presence was a solid anchor in the swirling chaos. They say he is missing, the nurse said, her voice a dry leaf whisper. Not dead, missing. It is the same, Akiko managed, the words raw. No, the nurse said with startling firmness. It is not. Dead is an end. Missing is a story not yet finished. My brother was missing for 2 winters after a battle. He came back with one less eye and a head full of songs from a place no one knew. She fixed Akiko with a sharp look. You have fought well these past weeks. You have shown spine. Do not let her win by making you mourn a man who may yet need you to be clever. The words were a lifeline thrown into the abyss. Missing is a story not yet finished. Akiko clutched at it. The pain didn't lessen, but it transformed. From a paralyzing grief, it hardened into a different, more terrible substance. A furious, desperate hope. And beneath that, a new chilling certainty. An ambush on the Mutsu Road. Bandits, or maybe a kuto. Outlaws. But the timing was too perfect. The assignment itself had been Lady Fuji's doing. Was this the final move? Not just exile, but eradication? She looked up at the nurse, her eyes dry now, burning. Thank you, she whispered. The old woman nodded, patted her shoulder once, and shuffled away, leaving Akiko alone in the whispering bamboo. She rose slowly, her body stiff. The world came back into focus, but it was a different world. A world where love was a vulnerability that could be exploited, where promises could be washed away in blood as easily as in river water. The game was no longer about survival or even about winning a position. It was a hunt, and the quarry was no longer just her own safety. She touched the pouch at her waist. Missing is a story not yet finished. She would write the next chapter, and she would use every tool she had, every verse, every hidden charm, every scrap of dangerous knowledge. To do it, the serpent had struck at her heart. Now she would learn to wield her own venom. Part 7. Winter in the Heart. The world turned to glass, not the beautiful, delicate glass of a palace ornament, but the thick, frosted kind that distorts everything behind it. Akiko moved through her duties as Lady Umi's attendant with a mechanical precision that was more chilling than any outburst of grief. She spoke when required, her voice a flat, polite monotone. She arranged flowers, sorted correspondence, and read poetry aloud. But the words had no texture, no meaning. They were empty shells, color drained from the world. The vibrant crimsons and golds of the autumn maples outside looked like stains. The intricate layers of her kimono were just weights of fabric, their poetic names, lingering twilight, frost-bitten aster, now absurd lies. She began to dress in the simplest, most subdued combinations she could manage without attracting comment. Shades of gray, dusty lavender, the color of old snow. She stopped using perfume altogether. The world of scent, once a complex language, now felt like a vulgar charade. Her only outlet was poetry, but not the clever, barbed verses she had used as a weapon. She wrote in the dark, on coarse, gray paper that held no fragrance, using ink that was thin and watery. These were not poems for anyone's eyes. They were the stark, bleeding transcriptions of a hollowed-out heart. The river flows north, carrying a promise woven of 2 strands of night. Now the water holds only the reflection of cold stars. The lantern is dark. The post stands bare in the wind. Where the shadow met, there is only the imprint of footsteps in vanished frost. She did not send them. She wrote them, read them once by the guttering light of a single candle, and then fed them to the flame. The ash was gray, like everything else. Lady Fuji observed this winter within Akiko, with the satisfaction of a gardener watching a troublesome weed wither from the roots. The pressure, which had been a series of probing attacks, now became a steady, suffocating weight. It was the silent, confident pressure of victory. A new rumor began to circulate, this one with a sympathetic, pitying tone. It spoke of Akiko's fragile constitution, of a melancholy of the spirit that made her unfit for the vigorous social life of the court. It was suggested in hushed, concerned tones that the pious solitude of a mountain nunnery might be the best solace for such a delicate, unfortunate soul. It was a masterstroke. It framed exile as mercy, erasure as healing. Lady Fuji was not just removing a piece from the board, she was offering to sweep it gently into a box, out of sight and mind forever. Lady still weak but with her senses returning, tried to intervene. "They are pushing you towards the veil, little bird," she whispered one afternoon, her hand over Akiko's cold one. "You must not let them. You must fight." "What is there to fight for?" Akiko asked, the question not defiant, but genuinely empty. The hope the old nurse had kindled, missing is not dead, had been buried under the relentless, freezing weight of the days. The story felt finished. "For yourself," pleaded, her eyes bright with tears. "For the girl who asked what the fan means." But that girl felt like a character from someone else's story, a foolish, ghostly thing who believed in questions and water wheel diagrams. The formal suggestion came not from Lady Fuji directly, but from the mistress of attendance, her face a mask of bureaucratic sympathy. "Given the recent strains, and for the peace of your own spirit, the option of retreat to the nunnery at Yokawa has been considered. It is a most holy, serene place. Many of noble house find profound peace there." The unspoken words hung in the air, before they become an embarrassment, before they break completely. Akiko heard the words as if from a great distance. Yokawa. It was a beautiful cage, high in the mountains, where the world would be reduced to chanting, to freezing dawns, to the endless, silent contemplation of one's own extinction. It was a kind of death, but a clean, honorable one. The temptation to surrender, to let the frost take her completely, was a seductive whisper. To stop fighting the cold, to become part of the winter. It was this whisper that finally drove her, one last time, to the margins of the city. She needed an answer, not from the court, but from the only person who spoke a language that acknowledged true darkness. She needed to see Saimai. She went through the motions of the errand with the dull competence of a sleepwalker. The guard was different this time, less bored, more observant. Lady Fuji's net was tightening, but Akiko was past caring about detection. The strange, silent bubble around Seimei's dwelling felt different now. Before, it had been a sanctuary of potent knowledge. Now it felt like the antechamber of an oracle who dealt only in harsh truths. She entered, the smell of ozone and mugwort doing nothing to pierce the chill inside her. Saimei was as before, kneeling by his blue brazier. He did not turn as she entered. "The winter has reached you," he stated, his blind eyes fixed on the empty air. "It has settled in your kokoro, your heart-mind. You have come to ask if you should let it freeze you." "They want to send me to a nunnery," she said, her voice rustling like dead leaves. "Perhaps they are right. Perhaps that is the only peace." "Peace?" Simi's lip curled slightly. "Or oblivion. There is a difference. One is a clearing, the other is a burial." "He is gone," she said, the words finally cracking the ice, releasing a pain so acute she almost gasped. "The story is over. What clearing can there be?" "You are holding on to the story," Simi said. "You are holding on to the promise, the hope, the fear, the pain. You have made a shrine of the wound, and you are praying to it. This is not grief. This is possession. You are letting a mononoke of your own making inhabit you." His words were a slap. They were not gentle, they were not poetic. They were a diagnosis. "You taught me to fight, to reflect malice," she cried, the first real emotion she had felt in weeks surging up, hot and bitter. "I taught you to manage spiritual poison," he corrected sharply. "The most insidious poison is not always sent by an enemy. Sometimes we brew it in our own hearts. The ritual you need now is not one of reflection or defense or attack. It is the only ritual that truly cleanses the soul. The ritual of release." He turned his clouded gaze toward her, and for the first time, she saw something in it that was not sharp intelligence, but something akin to pity, weathered and deep. You cling to the thread even though you fear it is attached to a corpse. You must let the thread go, not because he is dead, but because your clutching is killing you, and a dead woman cannot help anyone, living or otherwise. How? The word was a whisper. You have written your poems of grief. Good. Now you must perform a katashiro for your own heart. You must make a vessel for all this frozen pain, and then you must give it to the elements. You must say farewell to the hope, to the specific future you imagine, not to the person, but to the story you are telling yourself about your loss. It is the only way to see what remains when the story burns away. He guided her, his instructions simple and stark. He gave her a small, rough pottery bowl, unfired and porous. The earth, he said, then a vial of water from his well. The water, a pinch of ash from his brazier. The fire. Finally, he handed her a goose feather. The air and your breath, and your tears if they will come. They are the salt that preserves and purifies. Alone in a corner of his sparse room, Akiko knelt. She placed the bowl before her. This felt different from the protective circles or the reflective ritual. This felt terrifyingly intimate, like surgery on her own spirit. She closed her eyes and instead of pushing the pain away, she did the unthinkable. She invited it. She let herself feel the full, crushing weight of Sutomu's absence. Not just the noble sorrow, but the selfish, aching loneliness. The fury at the stolen future. The cold terror of a path stretching ahead without his laughter to lighten it. She gathered the memory of the braided lock of hair, the feel of his fingers brushing her cheek, the sound of his voice saying, "I will come back." She gathered the hope, beautiful and fragile, and she acknowledged its death. Tears came then, not the stormy sobs of fresh grief, but a slow, silent river that felt like it was melting the ice from the inside out. They fell into the rough clay bowl, mixing with the water she poured, the ash she sprinkled. She breathed over it, using the feather to stir the thin, gray slurry, whispering not an incantation, but a farewell. "I release the story," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I release the hope that binds me to this pain. I let go of the future we imagined. I set you free in the elements, and I set myself free from the waiting." It was not about letting go of him. It was about letting go of the frozen monument she had built to her own despair. As she spoke the words, a palpable shift occurred within her. It was not happiness. It was not even relief. It was a sudden, vast stillness. The howling, frozen wind in her soul quieted, leaving behind a landscape that was blank, scarred, but calm. The unbearable tension of clinging to a ghost simply dissolved. She opened her eyes. The slurry in the bowl looked like nothing. Muddy water, gray tears, common ash. It held no magic, only the physical residue of her surrender. Sime, sensing she was done, nodded. "Now give it back, all of it." He led her out to his small, barren garden plot. There she dug a shallow hole with her hands in the cold earth. Into it, she poured the contents of the bowl. She covered it over, patting the soil down. It was a burial of her winter. She stood, her hands dirty, her face streaked with dried tears, her heart empty. But it was a clean emptiness, a quiet room after a storm has passed. The crushing weight was gone. In its place was a cold, clear clarity. She looked at Simai. "What remains?" she asked. "You do," he said simply, "without the story. Now you can see what is actually there. Not what you fear or what you hope, but what is. That is the only ground from which true action can grow. Go back to your porcelain house. See it with winter's eyes, clear and merciless." The journey back to the palace was different. The cold air on her face felt sharp, bracing, not hostile. The city's chaotic noises were just sounds, not assaults. The grief was still a part of her, a deep, quiet scar, but it was no longer a cage. When she returned to her tiny room, she did not look at her gray robes with despair. She looked at them as a uniform. She took out the river stone, its diagram faded. It was no longer a symbol of a lost promise. It was a tool, a reminder of practicality, of building, of foundations. She took out the pouch that had held the braided hair. It was empty now, the lock given to the river, the hope given to the earth. She placed the stone inside it instead. A new weight, a new purpose. Lady Fuji had won a battle. She had shattered a dream and almost broken a spirit. But in breaking the frozen shell of Akiko's grief, she had inadvertently revealed the core that remained. Not a gentle poetess, not a lovelorn girl, but a woman who had stared into the abyss of surrender and had chosen instead to let go of everything but her own will. The suggestion of the nunnery was still on the table. The pressure was still immense. But Akiko now saw it not as a sentence, but as a move in a game. And she saw her counter move with devastating clarity. She had a weapon, the most dangerous one imaginable. The knowledge of Lady Fuji's secret, impossible love for the low-born musician. It was a knife that could cut both ways, that could destroy her as easily as her enemy if mishandled. She had been too afraid, too entangled in her own struggles to consider using it. Now standing in the winter clear stillness of her own soul, she considered it. Not with panic, not with vengeful heat, but with the cold, pragmatic calculation of an engineer assessing a faulty foundation. To use it directly would be suicide. It would be an undeniable declaration of war, and would likely see her silenced permanently before the truth could gain traction. But information was power, and power could be leveraged. It could be hinted at. It could be used to create doubt, to fray confidence, to make a predator hesitate. It could be the stone that starts the avalanche. She would not run to the nunnery. She would not break. She would stay. And she would fight with the only thing she had left, the terrible, perfect truth. She would weave it into her net, not as the centerpiece, but as the hidden, razor-wire strand that would make the whole structure deadly. She looked at her reflection in the bronze mirror. The face was pale, the eyes shadowed, but they were no longer hollow. They were the clear, still eyes of someone who has nothing left to lose, and therefore everything to gain. The winter in her heart had thawed, leaving behind a field of hard, fertile ground. She was ready to plant her vengeance. Part 8. Blooming Under Snow. The plan was not an act of war, but a performance, a tragedy in 3 acts, where the antagonist would write her own downfall. Akiko, standing in the clear, cold emptiness Seimei's ritual had granted her, saw the stage with the dispassionate eye of a stage manager. Every prop, every line of dialogue, every entrance and exit was plotted. She felt no thrill, no vengeful heat, only the precise, chilling focus of a gardener about to remove a poisonous plant, root and stem. Act 1, The Whisper. She composed not one, but a series of 3 anonymous poems. They were not accusations. They were delicate, melancholic sighs, the kind that lingered in the air after a poignant piece of music. They were designed to be found floating, copied by unseen hands, passed from sleeve to sleeve. The first spoke of a lone pine on a high cliff, yearning for the song of a passing storm bird. The imagery was of unattainable love between things of different realms, the rooted aristocrat and the free, wild musician. The second was more direct. The flute's note, pure and wild, finds an echo in the frozen lake. What mirror dares to hold a sound that cannot break? It hinted at a reflection, a secret listener moved by forbidden music. The third was the crucial one, a masterpiece of plausible deniability that nonetheless struck like a needle. They praised the mountain's snowy peak, so still, so pure, so high. Who sees the fragile flower that grows in its secret lee and tries to touch the sky? A mountain, Fuji, a secret flower, the musician. The act of reaching for something above one's station. The poems were just suggestive enough to make people think, to make them look at Lady Fuji during the next Gagaku performance and wonder about her too perfect stillness. Akiko did not release them all at once. She let them drip into the court's consciousness over a week, like slow, cold water eroding stone. She used her small network. The loyal page left one where senior scribes gathered. The sympathetic maid let another flutter from her sleeve in a crowded corridor. The verses took root. She saw the curiosity in people's eyes, the slight shift in the way they watched the interaction, or lack thereof, between the austere lady and the beautiful flautist. A space of doubt was open. Act 2. The found object. This required more risk. Akiko needed a physical token, something that could be discovered and that would whisper of an intimate, impossible connection. She observed. She learned the musician's name was Kaido. He was disciplined, passionate, and poor. He owned little, but she noticed from her hidden vantage point that he wore a simple cord bracelet of braided red and white threads, a common folk talisman for health and passion. She could not steal it, but she could replicate it. Using coarse threads bought from a market vendor during her next sanctioned outing, she wove an identical bracelet. Then came the dangerous part. She needed to imbue it with a sense of kigare that was specific, not malicious, but intimate, personal. Following Seimei's principles of sympathy, she needed a link to both parties. For Lady Fuji, she used a nearly invisible thing, a single long hair, ink black, that she plucked from a comb left in a communal dressing room after one of Fuji's rare visits. For Kaido, she needed something of his spirit, not his body. She attended another rehearsal, and focusing not on the man, but on the music, she tried to catch the feeling of his playing, its wild sorrow, its undisciplined beauty. She held that impression in her mind as she carefully wound the single, long black hair around the center of the woven bracelet, whispering not a curse, but a simple truth. This is a secret. The bracelet was now a sympathetic object. It hummed with the tension of hidden observation and repressed desire. It was a perfect trap. She planted it through the disgruntled junior scribe from the ministry, who had access to many areas. She gave him precise instructions. It must be found in a liminal space, a place belonging to neither the inner women's quarters nor the outer men's domains, but where paths might surreptitiously cross. He chose a small covered walkway that led to the archive library, a place Lady Fuji was known to visit for genealogical scrolls, and where a musician might plausibly pass on an errand. He found it, exclaimed over its unusual presence to a fellow clerk, and turned it into the office of the Chamberlain as lost property. Its discovery was a minor, curious event, but when combined with the floating poems now circulating, the bracelet ceased to be just a lost trinket. It became a clue. Its rough, common man's weave contrasted starkly with the single, perfect, aristocratic black hair entwined within it. In the hothouse atmosphere of the court, the implication was explosive. A token from a low-born man, kept close by a high-born lady, and lost in a place of secret meetings. The gossip, which had been a murmur, became a low, excited roar. No one dared accuse Lady Fuji directly, but the absence of accusation was itself deafening. People watched her with new eyes. The mountain's snowy peak was being scrutinized for cracks. Lady Fuji, of course, sensed the shift. Akiko saw the first signs of strain, a barely perceptible tightness around the woman's eyes during a poetry gathering. A flicker of something dark and furious when a tittering group of junior ladies fell silent a little too quickly as she passed. Fuji was a master of control, but she was not used to being the subject of speculation, only its director. The poison she had so often administered was now in her own cup, and she could not identify the hand that had poured it. This was the moment for Act 3, the trap. Akiko knew Fuji's pride was her greatest weakness. The woman could not abide a mystery, could not tolerate an attack she could not counter. She would investigate, she would hunt, and in her arrogance, she would believe she could handle the matter herself, discreetly, ruthlessly. Akiko gave her a target. She composed one final poem, the most direct yet. It was written on a scrap of paper identical to that used for practice in Lady Umi's chambers. It contained only 2 lines. The Weaver of Whispers knows the flute's true song. The archive walkway holds more than scrolls. She did not sign it. She left it, sealed with a single silver coin for the young page, with instructions to deliver it secretly to a specific senior maid in Lady Fuji's household. A woman known for her venality and sharp eyes. The message would read like an attempt at blackmail from a greedy, low-level informant within Um's circle. It pointed a direct, if clumsy, finger at the location and the secret. It was bait, and Lady Fuji, her instincts honed by a lifetime of intrigue, took it. The stage was set for the final scene. The Autumn Banquet, a major court event where the Gagaku Orchestra would perform. Tension was high. The rumors were a live thing in the air. Lady Fuji, impeccable in layers of glacial waterfall and midwinter pine, presided over her faction with a face of carved ice. But her eyes were restless, scanning the crowd. She had received the note. She knew someone claimed knowledge. The banquet was a public gauntlet she had to run. Akiko, attending as part of Ume's modest retinue, watched from the shadows. She felt nothing but a cold, steady pulse. She had laid the path. Now she had to trust the serpent's nature. The performance began. Kaito the flautist played a solo passage, a heart-wrenching melody of loss and longing. As the last pure note hung in the air, Akiko saw it. Lady Fuji's control slipped. Just for an instant, her eyes closed, not in appreciation, but in a spasm of such raw, unconcealed emotion, a mix of anguish, possession, and fury, that it was unmistakable to anyone watching. And many were. A soft, collective intake of breath rustled through the nearby attendees. It was the confirmation the rumors needed. The banquet proceeded, but the atmosphere was charged. During a lull, Akiko saw Lady Fuji's senior maid, the venal one, approach her mistress and whisper urgently. Fuji's expression tightened. She rose with fluid grace and glided from the pavilion, followed by the maid. She was going to confront the alleged blackmailer. She was going to the archive walkway to reclaim control, to threaten, to silence. This was the violation. The archive walkway after dark, during a state banquet. For a senior consort to secretly meet anyone there, especially on the heels of such scandalous rumors, was a profound breach of protocol. But Fuji, in her arrogance and panic, believed her authority could cloak any action. Akiko had anticipated this. She had also, through her network, ensured that the Chamberlain of the Right, a stern traditionalist and rival to Fuji's faction, would receive an anonymous tip about a matter of grave protocol being violated near the archives tonight. He was a man who valued rules above personalities. The finale played out in swift, silent strokes. As Lady Fuji, her voice a low, venomous hiss, confronted the confused and terrified young page, who had been told to wait there with a message about herbs for Lady The Chamberlain and 2 senior witnesses emerged from the shadow of the archive door. The scene was damning. The highest-ranking lady of the court, in a forbidden location, in a secretive meeting with a lowly page, at the height of a scandal about her and another lowborn man. Lady Fuji, the Chamberlain's voice cut through the night, cold with disapproval. You are far from the banquet, and in most unsuitable company. Explain this. For the first time, Akiko saw true emotion on Lady Fuji's face that was not anger or calculation, but shock. Then a dawning horror as she realized the depth of the trap. She had been lured into a public breach by her own need to dominate the narrative. Her composure shattered. This is an outrage, a setup. This creature was attempting to extort me with vile slanders. She pointed a trembling finger at the petrified page. What slanders, my lady? The Chamberlain asked, his tone icy. And why would you deign to meet their purveyor here, alone in the dark? The unspoken words hung in the air. Unless they contained a grain of truth you feared. It was over. The evidence of the breach was undeniable. The context of the rumors made her motive suspect. The Chamberlain, long vexed by Fuji's influence, had his weapon. The scandal could not be contained. The fall was swift and brutal. The head of the Fujiwara clan, furious at the damage to family honor and the political capital lost, acted with cold efficiency. There was no trial, no public spectacle. A quiet decree was issued. For grave lapses in judgment and conduct unbecoming her station, Lady Fuji was to retire from court life. Permanently, she was to take the vows of a nun and reside at the remote, austere monastery of Jakoin, a place known for its harsh winters and absolute isolation. It was not just exile, it was entombment. The news reverberated through the palace like a thunderclap, followed by an eerie silence. The mountain had been leveled. Akiko heard it standing in garden, her hands buried in the soil of a chrysanthemum pot. She felt no triumph, only a vast, hollow exhaustion. She had used the cruel, coded language of this world to destroy one of its masters. She had won. She was safe. Was safe. That night in the quiet of her chamber, the reality settled upon her. She was free of the immediate threat. Her cleverness was acknowledged in whispers of awe and fear. She had a status now, unspoken but real. The girl who had outmaneuvered Lady Fuji. She was no longer raw material. She was a player, and it tasted like ashes. She was alone. The garden of her life, weeded of its most poisonous plant, was empty. Tsutomu was a ghost in the north. The memory of him was no longer a bleeding wound, thanks to Saimei's ritual, but it was a quiet, permanent chamber in her heart, furnished with absence. She had fought for survival and won a battlefield, but the cost was the last of her girlhood illusions. She had become what she beheld, a creature of calculation, of hidden moves, of mirrors that reflected poison. A light snow began to fall, the first of the season. She walked to the small, neglected garden plot near the servants' quarters, the one with the wild, hardy plants. Kneeling, she brushed the light dusting from the earth. And there, against all odds, she saw them. A few late-blooming fukujuso flowers, their small, defiant yellow heads pushing through the frozen crust, blooming under the snow. A symbol of perseverance, of life insisting on itself in the dead of winter. She touched one fragile petal, and for the first time since the news of the ambush, she felt something thaw within her. Not joy, but a faint, tremulous sense of continuity. Life, stubborn and quiet, went on. It was in this moment of bitter, quiet victory, kneeling in the thin snow with the defiant flowers, that the old nurse found her. The woman's face was grim, but her eyes were alight with something other than sorrow. "Mistress," the nurse said, her voice low and urgent. "A messenger. From the north. He came to the ministry, half dead himself weeks ago. The news only just cleared the bureaucracy." Akiko's heart stopped. The world constricted to the old woman's lips. "The young Lord Tsutomu, he lives." The words did not compute. They were sounds in a foreign tongue. Lives. The ambush, it was Akuto, outlaws, but well organized. His guard was killed. He was wounded, left for dead. A woodcutter's family found him, hid him, nursed him. It took months. He's been sending reports, remarkable reports, they say, on the actual conditions in Mutsu. The corruption of the local officials, real plans for the ditches. They reached the emperor. His Majesty was impressed. Akiko could not breathe. The frozen ground beneath her knees seemed to spin. He is returning, not in disgrace. He is being recalled, given a new commission, real authority, in the capital. The nurse allowed herself a small, fierce smile. He returns with the first thaw. Akiko sat back on her heels, the snow soaking through her robes, unnoticed. The yellow fukujuso blurred before her eyes. He lives. He returns. The story was not finished. The thread she had released to the elements had not been severed. It had been stretched to its limit, thin as a spider's silk, but it had held. But the woman who rose slowly from the garden plot was not the girl who had wept by the river. That girl was gone, refined away by grief and conflict and hard-won skill. She was Akiko, who had faced a witch and won, who had learned the taste of mugwort and the geometry of power, who had buried her winter, and he would not be the same either. The idealistic engineer who spoke of walls and ditches had faced bandit steel, the kindness of peasants, the labyrinth of frontier corruption, and the emperor's ear. He would be harder, sharper, tempered by real fire. They would meet again, not as a clerk and a sheltered maiden, but as two people who had passed through their own separate hells and emerged, scarred and capable, on the other side. The promise on the river was no longer a fragile, romantic secret. It was a pact between survivors. The game was not over. The board had just gotten larger, and they both had new pieces to play. She looked at the stubborn yellow flowers under the snow, then towards the north, where the first thaw would come from. The winter in her heart was over. What grew in its place would be stronger, rooted in hard earth, capable of weathering any storm. She touched the pouch at her waist, feeling the solid weight of the river stone within. A blueprint, a foundation. The palace around her was quiet, the serpent defeated, but the porcelain house still stood. And now she knew she was not just a shadow on its screen or a reflection in its pools. She was a stone in its garden, and she was ready to build. Epilogue. A new ritual. They met not by the river, but in a small, sun-drenched courtyard of the Ministry of Popular Affairs. It was a place of practicality, not poetry. Gravel underfoot, plain wooden benches, the distant sound of clerks arguing over tax quotas. The air smelled of ink, dust, and the faint green scent of a potted pine. He was waiting for her, standing by a wooden column. The first thing she noticed was not the new, finer cut of his official robe, nor the subtle authority in his posture. It was the scar, a thin, pale line that traced from his temple down to his jaw, a whisper of violence against his skin. His eyes found hers, and they were the same, intelligent, ironic, but the light in them was different, not dimmed, but refined, like steel forged in a hotter fire. She approached, her own movements unadorned by the excessive layers of court performance. She wore a simple, elegant kimono in a deep, practical blue. Her face bore no excessive powder, and her smile, when it came, was small, real, and touched with a sorrow that was now part of her foundation. "Engineer," she said, her voice clear in the quiet space. "Observer," he replied. A ghost of his old smile touched his lips, but it was weary, knowing. There were no embraces, no tears. They sat on the bench, a respectful space between them, looking out at the gravel and the pine. "You are different," he said, not as judgment, but as observation. "So are you. The North writes its own lessons, in frost and in blood." He flexed the fingers of his right hand. They moved stiffly, another small injury. "Your poems found their way to me, the ones about the fan, and the later ones, the mountain and the flower. They were a map. I understood the terrain you were describing, even from a distance. And your reports," she said. "They say the emperor read them himself, that you spoke of the people, not just the yield. I spoke of ditches that needed digging, and of officials who were stealing the shovels. It seems honesty, when it survives an ambush, becomes riveting insight." He said it with no pride, only a dry fatigue. "They have given me a title, a real one. Oversight of Public Works for 3 Western provinces. It is an attempt to co-opt the nuisance, I suppose, to put the critic in charge of the problem." He turned to look at her fully. "And you? The palace whispers of your horticultural skills, that you cleared a garden of a particularly persistent, poisonous weed. I learned to recognize the root system," she said quietly, "and that some plants cannot be pruned. They must be removed entirely." A long silence stretched between them, comfortable in its mutual understanding. The unsaid things, the ambush, the curse, the fear, the winter of the heart, hung in the air, acknowledged but not dissected. They had both walked through fire. There was no need to compare burns. This system, Tsutomu said at last, gesturing vaguely toward the grand halls of the palace, visible over the wall. We cannot break it. It is too old, too heavy. I know, Akiko said, but a system is made of parts, and parts can be replaced or improved, or simply made to function as they were meant to. He looked at her, his gaze steady. My post requires a household, a base of operations outside the capital. The provinces are not the court. The rituals are different. They are about harvests and bridges, injustice that can be seen, not hinted at. He was offering her a choice, not a proposal of passion, but an invitation to a partnership, a shared project, to leave the porcelain house and build something real, with real walls and real ditches, in a world where their hard-won skills, his administration, her perception, their shared understanding of hidden structures, could be used for creation, not just survival. Akiko looked down at her hands, no longer just the tools for calligraphy, but hands that had mixed ash and salt, that had felt the grip of feverish fear, that had buried her own grief in cold earth. She thought of Mei's lessons. Rituals were tools. The court had used them to build a cage of breathtaking beauty. She had learned to use them as lockpicks and mirrors. Now she could choose to use them as cornerstones. She looked up, meeting his tempered gaze. A household needs order, its own rhythms, its own rituals. Ones that serve a purpose, he agreed, not just a display. She nodded once. It was not a dramatic acceptance. It was a consensus, a meeting of two minds that had been shaped by parallel ordeals and arrived at the same quiet conclusion. The farewells at court were brief. Lady Ume, her health mending along with her spirit, pressed a small plain journal into Akiko's hands. For poems about real things, she whispered, her eyes bright. The old nurse simply hugged her, a fierce, wordless embrace. There was no fanfare for the departure of a minor lady in waiting, even one shrouded in whispered legend. It was a relief. Their new home was a modest, well-built residence in the provincial capital of Tsutomu's new jurisdiction. It looked out not on a manicured pond, but on a bustling market street and beyond, the green patchwork of fields. The air smelled of earth, cooking fires, and possibility. On the first morning, Akiko sat at a simple desk by a window overlooking a small private garden she intended to plant herself, with herbs, vegetables, and perhaps a single, defiant plum tree. Before her lay not exquisite perfume paper, but a stack of coarse, practical sheets for household accounts and correspondence. She took one sheet and with a brush dipped in dark, honest ink, she began to write. Not a courtly tanka, but a new kind of verse, in a form that felt true to her now. Bamboo in the storm, bends low, whispers to the earth, its green heart unbroken. Not the rigid oak that splits, but the flexible strength that gives, and in giving, endures. She read it over, the words simple, the metaphor clear. It spoke of resilience, of adaptability, of a strength that was not brittle but living. It was a poem for a life that was to be lived, not just performed. She did not fold it into an elaborate shape. She did not scent it. She let the ink dry, then walked to where Tsutomu's travel satchel lay by the door, ready for his first tour of inspection. Into its main compartment, between a rolled map and a report on irrigation channels, she slipped the sheet of paper. It was not a love letter to be hidden in a lacquered box. It was a statement of principle for a working partnership. A note for a fellow builder to find at the end of a long day. A reminder of the foundation they were choosing to lay together. From the window, she watched him in the courtyard below, speaking with a local foreman, pointing at a diagram. He was listening, his head tilted, his scarred face intent. He was where he was meant to be, and so, for the first time, was she. The ritual of their old lives was over. The ritual of their new one had just begun. It would be built not on whispers and poison fans, but on clean water, sturdy bridges, honest words. in the quiet, resilient understanding of two people who had chosen to bend so they would not break. And now, my dear friend, let's slowly return together from this world of silk rustles and moon gardens. Do you feel the softness of the pillow under your cheek? Do you hear the quiet, familiar sounds of your house? Perhaps it's raining outside the window, or a single street lamp is shining. You and I have traveled a long way through the ages, but now you are safe, warm, and under your own real wing. The rituals that surrounded Akiko, choosing colors, folding letters, even the silent speech of a fan, seem so far away to us. But think about it. But you and I have our own rituals. A cup of evening tea, a certain procedure before going to bed, a favorite blanket, which is so nice to wrap yourself in. It's our way of telling the world and ourselves, I'm here, I'm safe. This moment belongs to me. We no longer blacken our teeth, but we still create small islands of meaning and beauty in the flow of days. And that's fine. Akiko and Tsutomu found their way to build something real where their hands and hearts could bring real benefits. And I believe that you will also find, or have already found, your own way to be strong and flexible, like that bamboo. Not in the dramas of palace intrigues, but in the warmth of his own real life. Now let your breathing become smoother and deeper. Let your thoughts float away like autumn leaves. The weight of centuries, which you and I briefly tried on, remain there in history. But here there is only comfort, peace and quiet that comes after a good long story. And know that this road does not end. There are still so many eras in the world waiting to tell you their bedtime story. New stories will be waiting for you here every week as the most comfortable and long-awaited date. In order not to miss any of them, just make one simple and kind gesture. Subscribe to our channel. Then no beautiful epic will pass by your heart. Now, close your eyes. Imagine a quiet garden under the first snow, where the seeds of next spring are already dormant under a white blanket. You deserve this peace. Sweet dreams, my dear listener. See you soon.